Okay, let's go ahead and kick this off. As soon as I said that, I get two more people joining. Give them a moment to actually get logged in. So I'm going to go ahead and kick us off. So hello and welcome to this Intune webinar. My name is Brian Nielsen. I'm the tech lead for Opsagility. So as global experts for consulting and also training delivery, we pride ourselves on being a tier 1 direct cloud solution provider for Microsoft. Our team of experts includes Microsoft certified trainers with years of experience in delivering high quality training, consulting services to organizations of all sizes. We're actually a women-owned small business, so we're committed to promoting diversity and inclusion in the industry. So whether you're looking for expert guidance on cloud strategy, training to enhance your technical skills, or a solution to help your organization manage the benefits of Microsoft technologies, we're here to help. Our commitment to delivering high-quality services and our reputation as an industry-recognized cloud technology experts make us the partner of choice for organizations worldwide. We do understand the challenges of keeping up to date with the latest updates and trends in the industry, so our technical training services are designed to help keep your team up to date with the latest tools and practices. Our cloud consulting services include expert guidance to help you optimize your cloud strategy and make the most of your investment in Azure and other Microsoft cloud services. Our managed services ensure that your infrastructure is always up to date, secure, and running smoothly, freeing up your resources to focus on your core business. Whether you're looking to improve your technical skills, optimize your cloud infrastructure, or simplify IT operations, our team of experts is here to help you achieve your goals. We do offer a range of training to help suit your needs. This includes dedicated, virtual, dedicated on-site, custom, and also Microsoft official certification courses. Our content is equally diverse, including custom curriculum, demo guides, demo click-throughs, lab guides, hackathons, presentations, and even recorded videos. We offer virtual conference services that can be securely hosted in Microsoft Teams with the ability to scale to thousands of attendees. We have an interactive group activity management that ensures smooth event management. We also provide an integrated Azure 365 lab environment for hands-on training. We do also offer badge issuing support. And also virtual conferences, which we offer lab hosting solutions for on-demand labs, hands-on workshops, and also hosted hackathons. Some of the projects we can assist with include Azure migration, cloud data development, architecture design, backup and disaster recovery, data management, and analytics. We also can do team setup and configuration, Dynamics customization, Dynamics 365 app development, Power Apps, robotic process automation, Power Automate, and also Power BI analytics. We also offer an entire suite of managed services. This includes dedicated customer success managers, technical support management, licensing and consumption reporting, scheduling of training engagements, scheduling of consulting requests, Microsoft Cloud services. That includes the government cloud for government. There's also 24/7 security and compliance monitoring, 24/7 performance and outage monitoring. There's also easy ad hoc IT consulting. We also offer you backup and resiliency testing, and also the ability to create custom applications. Thanks for listening to my introduction, and now we're going to kick off our Intune webinar with Marcin Pollack, our infrastructure practice lead. Now we'll stop sharing and let Marcin share.
Thank you, Brian. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Microsoft Intune Level 100 webinar. We'll start maybe with a bit of logistics. As you might know, this is meant to take about 4 hours. We need to take one break in between, probably around 1 p.m. Central Time, for about 15 minutes. And there's a fairly decent amount of slides we're going to go through to introduce the concepts of device management and application management with Microsoft Intune. Keep in mind, this is meant to be an introduction, level 100. We certainly welcome your participation in future webinars that will go beyond that to level 200, potentially 300. So For starters, we're going to talk about device and application management from the conceptual standpoint. Once we cover that aspect of technology, we'll look into the equivalent concepts in the context of Microsoft Intune. Let's start with introduction to device and application management. And in general, device management is meant to enable organizations to administer and maintain devices, including virtual machines, physical machines, mobile devices, IoT devices. This is a critical component of an organization's security and management strategy. It helps ensure that devices are secure, up to date, and compliant with organizational policies and standards, with the overall goal of protecting the corporate network and data from unauthorized access. This became especially important in recent years because of the pandemic and increased significance of the remote and hybrid workforces. So in that context, it became particularly important to ensure that you have a solid device management strategy. And there are a couple of ways to approach that management. There are basically two main strategies here, the one which are listed on the current slide, namely mobile device management and mobile application management. Mobile device management represents, the term itself represents an industry standard for managing mobile devices. Those include smartphones, tablets, laptops, as well as desktop computers. And with MDM in place, you would be able to deploy apps to devices, restrict devices to specific operating systems, block or allow the use of personal devices. If a device is ever lost or stolen, you'll be able to remove all data from the device. The second approach is referred to as mobile application management. And this allows you to manage applications or apps on devices. The purpose is to accommodate scenarios where users use their personal devices typically to access organizational resources. And when users open an application, such as, for example, Outlook or SharePoint, they'll be prompted to authenticate. And similarly here, if the device is ever lost or stolen, you as an IT admin will be able to remove the organizational data from the managed applications on those devices. Now, that's not to say that you cannot use MAM or MDM on different types of devices. Namely, you can certainly implement MDM on personal devices if that's what your kind of company requires. Likewise, you can use MAM on corporate-owned devices. As a matter of fact, that's typically the case when combined with MDM. So those can be used together. They can be used separately. It ultimately depends on your needs. The current slide also provides some basic functionality that you can expect from MDM and from MAM. Note that this is not meant to be an exhaustive list. It's simply meant to drive the distinction between the two and provide the most common use cases. So with MDM, you control the entire device, hence the name. You have the option of retiring the device by removing user app data and settings. And the details would really differ or depend on the choice of the operating systems. And also you have the option of applying a full wipe, which resets the device to the factory settings. With MAM, you focus on application management. This allows you to provide the capability of removing business data. That's referred to as so-called selective wipe. You also have the ability to control the data transfer between the personal apps and business apps. So you essentially address the issue of potential data loss due to employees using personal devices to copy data between personal apps and business apps. Now, from the Microsoft MDM's perspective, so the previous slide was really focused on the two main concepts we'll be discussing throughout the remaining slides for the next few hours. This slide is meant to provide a bit of a clarity regarding the different MDM options available from Microsoft. And Microsoft offers basically two main options to implement MDM. The first one is referred to as a basic mobility and security. The second one is the one we just focused of this webinar, which is Microsoft Intune. Maybe let's start with Intune. That is essentially a standalone product included with certain Microsoft 365 plans. Basic mobility and security is part of all Microsoft 365 plans. They both give you the ability to manage mobile devices in your organization, but there are key differences in their capabilities, as illustrated on the current slide. You can actually start with basic mobility and security, and then you cannot really start with basic mobility and security if you're already using Microsoft Intune. So basically, the idea is to make sure that if you decide to use those two together, you start in the proper sequence. So you can manage users on their mobile devices using both Intune and basic mobility and security in the same Microsoft 365 business standard organization by setting the basic mobility and security first, and then adding Microsoft Intune on top of that. This allows you to choose the first one, the basic mobility and security, in order to implement some of the core functionality for some of the users that are not necessarily requiring to have the full set of features available in Intune, and effectively you can gear towards the optimal usage according to your preferences while minimizing cost at the same time. If you look at the current slide, you have a bit of an insight into what those features are. So in the left column, you see core device management, subset of configuration settings, most common device types, security policies and access rules, full wipe, selective wipe, and retire. Notice there's no support for conditional access integration. There's no support for implementing Wi-Fi and the VPN profiles. There's no support to manage browser, and there's no autopilot integration. You get those features with Intune. So Intune, in addition to the core features supported by basic mobility and security, also provides you with the support for autopilot integration, conditional access, Wi-Fi and VPN profiles, MAM. There's support to manage browser in the form of Edge app, and there's also support for software updates. Another consideration when we start looking into implementation of Microsoft Intune in our organization is to evaluate different endpoint management options. We'll talk about a good portion of those in more detail later on, but this just from the high-level perspective, endpoint management represents a policy-based approach to security that requires devices to comply with specific criteria before they're granted access to organizational resources. And there's a set of products which are considered to be part of the Microsoft Intune family. That term, by the way, has been evolving recently, actually over a few years. So we'll talk about what exactly Intune comprises in a moment. The intention is basically to provide a set of capabilities you can choose from in order to optimally protect your data, both in the cloud and on-prem. So the term, actually, the previous term you might be likely aware of, familiar with, is the Microsoft Endpoint Manager. That suite, that term, that corresponding set of products is no longer applicable at this point. Microsoft refers to cloud management as Microsoft Intune, and to on-premises management as Microsoft Configuration Manager. So within that suite of products, we have Microsoft Intune, which provides app protection for app protection policies for getting control over data and policies that will access only to the right people under right conditions. Configuration Manager, it provides somewhat equivalent functionality for on-prem and hybrid scenarios. This includes deploying apps, software updates, deployment of operating systems, management of desktop servers and laptops. Obviously, only some of those some of the features are supported by Intune. Then we have the co-management strategy, which essentially combines the functionality of Configuration Manager and Microsoft Intune. It allows you to basically pick and choose the features that you want to implement by using one versus the other, depending on the circumstances, depending on preferences, depending on location of the resources you want to be able to manage. Another component is endpoint analytics. That's a cloud-based service which integrates with Configuration Manager and provides you with insights and intelligence for Windows 10 and 11 devices. And another one is Windows Autopilot that provides a zero-touch self-service Windows deployment platform to set up and pre-configure new devices, getting them ready for productive use. Now, this is also not meant to be a comprehensive listing. We'll see actually more details regarding the endpoint management strategy and Microsoft Intune family of products in a moment. But this should give us sufficient introduction to clearly define what we'll be talking about next. Another consideration is the set of integration points that exist from the endpoint management standpoint. In particular, we'll talk a bit more about the integration between Intune and Azure Active Directory, which at this point is part of Microsoft Entra. We'll talk about integration of Intune with Microsoft 365. There's also some integration points with certain products from the Microsoft Defender 365 family. And we mentioned Autopilot a moment ago, so that should ring a bell. There's also support for integration with Autopatch and Endpoint Analytics. And there's also integration with a number of third-party products. In particular, the one we're going to talk about a bit more is mobile threat defense, set of mobile threat defense solutions provided by third party. So let's start with Azure Active Directory. For those of you that are new to the Intune and cloud-based solutions from Microsoft, Azure AD is essentially a cloud-based identity and access management solution or service, which is integrated with a wide range of Microsoft products and services. It certainly has significant importance in regard to Intune. This extends to a wide range of SaaS applications, cloud-hosted apps. There's also a way to integrate Azure Active Directory with on-prem and legacy apps. And in particular, Azure AD is a prerequisite for implementing Microsoft Intune. Microsoft Intune relies on Azure AD to store and manage the identities of users and devices, along with groups that those devices and users are members of. For example, Intune policies you create get assigned to Azure AD users, devices, and groups. Actually, that happens through the group assignments. In addition, by assigning Intune licenses to Azure AD users, you can automatically trigger an enrollment of the corresponding devices during the user's sign-in. So there's certainly, for one, there's a prerequisite to have Azure AD in place when using Microsoft Intune, and that prerequisite actually comes into play in a wide range of scenarios. So the management of Intune implies the presence of Azure Active Directory and very close integration between the two. Now, as alluded to, by the information current slide, you can tell that one of the common scenarios that involve the use of Azure AD indicates integration or provides integration with Active Directory environments in on-prem data centers. So customers which are still operating on-prem, and certainly that's majority of the customers these days, they do have a way to rely on leverage Intune for their remote users by integrating Active Directory on-prem with Azure Active Directory, and effectively satisfying that prerequisite of having Azure AD in place. That integration is implemented by using a product which is called Azure AD Connect. Azure AD Connect is essentially a service designed to implement integration between one or more Active Directory domain services domains forests with an Azure AD tenant. That service includes a synchronization engine, which is deployed typically to on-prem location. This actually changed recently, so there's a support for something that's called Cloud Sync. So you can actually implement the Azure AD Connect a bit differently than illustrated on the current slide. But in essence, what it comes down to is there is basically an engine that sits either on-prem with a direct connection to a domain controller, or resides in the cloud and relies on the agents deployed on-prem in order to provide synchronization between objects residing in Active Directory domain services domains and forests, and the corresponding objects residing in Azure Active Directory tenant that will be associated eventually with Azure with the Intune subscription. And the engine replicates objects such as users, devices, and groups from Active Directory on-prem to a designated Azure AD tenant. Now, that's for the most part one-way synchronization. There's support for synchronization from the cloud to Active Directory as well, but that's by far more limited than what you'd replicate from on-prem to Azure AD. Now, that integration between Active Directory and Azure AD certainly contributes to productivity and enhances users' signing experience when providing access for cloud and hybrid resources. Effectively, the idea is to ensure that the users can use the same set of credentials to access both on-prem applications and cloud services, such as, for example, Microsoft 365 or Microsoft Intune. And besides synchronization, Azure AD Connect also provides several other features, including password hash synchronization, that synchronizes hash of users' on-prem passwords with the passwords associated with the Azure AD accounts. A pass-through authentication that essentially eliminates the need to synchronize password hashes, because what it does, it relies on the on-prem Active Directory to authenticate users when those users access cloud-based resources. So there's essentially communication between Azure AD and AD DS domain controllers in order to provide authentication for users who attempt to authenticate against Azure AD. And there's also support for federation. Federation's an optional part of Azure AD Connect, and can be used in situations where you rely on, let's say, ADFS or Ping Federate to authenticate users who access cloud-based resources. As I mentioned, when you actually consider implementing Azure AD, in case you are in a situation where you just entered the Microsoft Cloud, at that point, you might want to actually consider whether Azure AD Connect Cloud Sync would be a viable option. There's a number of criteria we need to consider. That's really not, this webinar is really not the place to discuss them, but just be aware of the fact that there's this additional option, which potentially might give you extra benefits. For one, it minimizes eliminates the most part, the overhead of managing Azure AD Connect on-prem. Now, with that integration between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory and Azure AD come into picture, we also need to take a look at the Azure AD device identity options. And that's very closely tied to the way Intune works, because for Intune to work, we basically need to have a representation of a device that will be managed by MDM, Intune in particular, in Azure Active Directory. So it basically needs to be a corresponding object in Azure Active Directory that represents the device you want to be able to manage. So besides the fact we need to have the user objects and group objects in Azure AD, you also have to have device objects. Now, the device object, I guess, in a sense, is similar to a computer object in Active Directory domain services. They are not identical, but for the most part, quite similar. And there are three basic ways to implement a device identity. There is Azure Active Directory registration, there's Azure AD join, and there's hybrid Azure AD join. Now, there are those rather roughly drawn pictures on the images on the current slide that are meant to convey the meaning of those. So let's talk about this a little bit. Actually, I have upcoming slides. We'll talk about them in a bit more detail, but I want to make sure that the premise, the basic idea behind those three options is clear. So the first one is Azure AD registered, which basically means this creates an object in Azure Active Directory representing a device, but that link between the device and the object in Azure AD is a bit not as strong as it is for the other two options. And effectively, you can accomplish this because of the fact that that correlation between the two is not as strong as it is with the other two options. You do have, on the other hand, more flexibility in terms of the device types you're going to be registering with Azure AD. So in this case, you do actually have support for other operating systems than Windows only. And effectively, notice that in this case, right, we don't have much of a correlation between the device itself and Active Directory. So even though Active Directory is integrated with Azure AD, the device itself is talking directly to Azure AD. The same happens with the Azure AD join. So in that sense, those two options are quite similar. But in this case, the correlation between the two, the link between the two is much stronger. And on the flip side, the outcome of it, the side effect of it, is the fact that Azure AD join is supported only for Windows operating systems. And we'll talk more about what exactly this means, what this translates to in a moment. Lastly, we have the hybrid Azure AD joined. So in this case, notice we actually have a link between the device and both Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. And as the result, there's actually a corresponding object in both Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. As a matter of fact, the way this works out is you rely on Azure AD Connect to replicate that object from Active Directory to Azure Active Directory rather than having the device join Azure AD or register with Azure AD directly. You still end up with a device object in Azure AD. So in that sense, the end result is somewhat similar. But that particular option is meant to be used in scenarios where you have devices which are Active Directory joined, and you want to be able to benefit from the cloud-based technologies to the largest extent while maintaining the object, the device itself, joined to Active Directory. Now, as the current slide states, modern device scenarios do focus on Azure AD registration and Azure AD join. So the hybrid Azure AD join, even though again is a certainly viable option, is meant to be more of an interim step towards Azure AD join, which gives you the largest extent of benefits. At the same time, though, keep in mind that all three scenarios can actually coexist in the single organization. So you can potentially transition from one to another at your own pace, and the kind of the coexistence of those will not really affect either one in a particular way. So let's talk a bit more about the specifics of those three different scenarios, because again, that will come into play when we talk about Intune. So First one, Azure AD registration. As I mentioned, in this case, you have also flexible in terms of the types of operating systems that you have support for. So it's supported on Windows 10 and 11. It's supported on Android, iOS, macOS. We really don't deal in this case with the versions beyond just Windows. Same would apply to Ubuntu, right? So actually, there's ways to register Ubuntu devices with Azure AD as well. Most commonly, that option will be used in the context of bring your own device scenarios. So this is meant to be used on personal devices. Because again, the idea behind is to actually allow users to maintain their personal devices the way they are used to, without much of an intrusion caused by, for example, Azure AD join. Effectively, by virtue of doing that, you will allow users on those devices to access organizations' Azure AD authenticated resources. However, in this case, with Azure AD registered devices, users would sign in to those devices by using a Microsoft account, local accounts. That their choice really differs differs with the choice of the operating system. Effectively, they can still rely on the same authentication mechanisms that exist on their device prior to registration, namely password PIN, Windows Hello, biometrics pattern. All those are supported, but the account you use to actually sign into the device is different from the one that was used to register the device in Azure AD. So that's one of the distinctions between this option and the other two. From the setup perspective, that is done differently depending on the OS on the device. So with Windows 10 11, you could use the settings app. With iOS, Android, macOS, you'd use Company Portal or Microsoft Authenticator app. And on Linux side, you would be using Intune agent. From the management standpoint, you do have the option of enrolling those into MDM, such as Intune. You also support for MAM as well. In regard to the key capabilities, you have support for single sign-on to cloud resources. So despite the fact that users are signing in with using their own accounts, the fact that the device is registered with Azure AD would allow the end user to authenticate automatically to cloud resources without having to provide credentials. Conditional access is based on an MDM compliance evaluation or net protection policy. We'll talk more about those later on. So again, if those terms are not familiar to you, that should become clear later today. Conditional access is basically a matter of protecting access to cloud-based resources by validating criteria that the organization chose in order to make sure that only properly secure devices and users are able to access the company's resources. And also you have the option of using the Microsoft Authenticator app-based sign-in. Next option is Azure AD join devices. In this case, as I mentioned, the fact that you join Azure AD displaces higher level of constraints in terms of the choice of the operating system. So in general, that's supported in Windows 10, Windows 11. There's actually support for joining Azure AD devices that run Windows Server 2022 and I believe 19 as well, but those would be running in Azure. So that option really is not really much of a concern to us because we don't deal with the server OS in context of Intune. So we really care only about 10 and 11 here. Typically, that will be used on organizations' own devices. And in this case, users sign in with the Azure AD accounts to the device, which basically means that you can use any of the Azure AD supported authentication methods, including Windows Hello for Business and FIDO security keys in order to authenticate to the Azure AD joint device. From the setup process perspective, you do have support for a number of options. So settings app would be certainly one of them. That's some kind of manual setup. Users can also use the Ubi experience during the initial setup of Windows. Typically in corporate environments, you actually rely on bulk enrollment, or potentially you would implement Windows Autopilot. So while per user setup is certainly an option, more commonly you'd see options geared towards mass deployments. We'll talk more about those later on. From the management standpoint, you do have support for MDM. You also have the ability to integrate Intune with Configuration Manager in the form of co-management. So co-management potentially is an option with Azure AD joint devices as well. And then as far as key capabilities, we look at the SSO for both cloud and on-prem resources. We support conditional access based on MDM compliance evaluation and app protection policies. So again, the same terms we saw on the previous slide coming to play here as well. Another option that becomes available to you is the self-service password reset and Windows Hello Pen reset. So that these are essentially capabilities that come with the territory. So that's what Azure AD supports. Another one is enterprise state roaming, which basically allows you to roam your settings across multiple devices. So you essentially maintain this consistent interface on your devices. If you have multiple devices and all of them are Azure AD joined, you can actually roam the settings across all of them. Next, we have hybrid Azure AD joined devices. Notice in this case, we essentially have support for both client and server Windows operating systems, and those go beyond Windows 10 and 11 on the client side. Although again, I guess at this point we need to be concerned with supportability by 8.1 to the 2012 R2. These are close to reaching end of life. This is meant to be used on organizational-owned devices. So by implication, the devices are joined to Active Directory, which typically means that those devices are actually company-owned. You do have Azure AD Connect in place. So the device objects on computer objects from Active Directory are being replicated to the Azure AD tenant. And in this case, the users would sign in with the account which match between Active Directory and Azure Active Directory. The implication is, again, you would basically be able to use the credentials the authentication methods which are supported by Azure AD. So those include password, Windows Hello for Business, and FIDO2. As far as the setup is concerned, this gets a bit more involved. So in essence, that commonly is done by that is essentially done by relying on the configuration of Azure AD Connect. That can also be done by leveraging the ADFS configuration. But ultimately, you need to be able to join Active Directory first, and that essentially, with proper configuration on the Azure AD Connect side, would replicate or synchronize the corresponding objects, computer objects to Azure AD, and effectively would make that connection between Active Directory, computer object, and Azure AD device object. For older versions of the OS, that actually would involve running Windows installer package that's available from the Microsoft Download Center. Management can be done by using group policy, typically will be performed by using Configuration Manager, standalone, or in co-management with Microsoft Intune. In terms of key capabilities, you do have a single sign-on for both cloud and on-prem resources. There is support for conditional access based on the device identity and compliance state with co-management. There is support for self-service password reset and Windows Hello Pen reset. That's subject to licensing. And then there's a support for enterprise state roaming. Okay, let's talk next about Microsoft Intune. So we essentially, so far, we talked about general aspects of device management solutions. we covered to, I think, somewhat meaningful extent the significance of Azure Active Directory in the context of Intune. Now let's talk more about Intune itself. And let's start with core functionality. Now, this is not really meant to be comprehensive either. We're going to certainly cover this in more detail on the upcoming slides. But the idea is to essentially just get you somewhat familiar with the features available in Microsoft Intune. Those are, to some extent, illustrated by the image on the right-hand side of the slide. But in general, you have support for user and device management, app management, automated policy deployment, and this applies to app security, device configuration, compliance, conditional access. Another one is self-service support. And lastly, we do have the integration, which was mentioned earlier, with third-party mobile threat defense vendors. As far as the management of users and devices, this includes devices owned by your organization, as well as personal owned devices. And Microsoft Intune supports Android open source project, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, and Windows client devices. With Intune, you can use those devices to securely access organizational resources with policies you create. Intune also simplifies app management with a built-in app experience, including app deployment, updates, and removals. You can connect to and distribute apps from your private app stores. You can enable Microsoft 365 apps. You can deploy Win32 apps, create app protection policies, and manage access to apps and their data. Intune also automates policy deployment, as mentioned here on the current slide. So that basically means when the policies that you create are ready, you can deploy those policies to users and devices via corresponding groups. And all that's needed for the devices to simply have the internet access in order to receive those and provide the outcome of it. To basically evaluate compliance and report the compliance back to Intune. As far as the self-service support, this is essentially meant to convey the ability to use the app portal app in order to reset or either a PIN or password, to install apps, to join groups, and so on and so on. And you as the Intune admin, you can customize the company portal app in order to optimize its usage to make it more friendly and effectively reduce the number of support calls regarding, for example, installation of apps or resetting passwords and PINs. Now, the mobile threat defense support is not actually limited to third-party services. This also comes into play in the context of the integration with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And with these services, the focus is on endpoint security, and you can create policies that respond to threats, that perform real-time risk analytics and automate remediation. You can also use the, I guess another benefit of using Intune is the fact that you do have this web-based admin center that provides with all the functionality integrated to same interface. This includes data-driven reporting, which is being updated on a regular basis. This also gives you the ability to, as an admin, to sign into the admin center from any device that has the internet access and supports the corresponding app. Also keep in mind that the admin center relies on Microsoft Graph to programmatically access the Intune services. So even though in this presentation, this webinar, we're going to focus on the way to interact with Intune, typically through the admin interface, there's a way to do it programmatically as well. As a matter of fact, you can do it through PowerShell. There's corresponding PowerShell module, which essentially gives you the ability to interact with Microsoft Graph. Now, let's talk a bit more about those different aspects of the functionality that is provided by Intune. Let's start with user device management, and that's essentially that topic, that aspect of management ties to the device lifecycle. Intune help you manage this lifecycle from enrollment through configuration protection all the way to retiring the device when it's no longer needed. For example, you can have an iPad which is purchased by your company, being enrolled through Intune to allow your company to manage it. And then you configure it according to your company standards, and effectively you are able to protect both the applications and user data and company's data on the device. And finally, when the iPad is no longer needed, you essentially retire, wipe all sensitive data on it and potentially uninstall any custom applications were installed during its lifetime. So we basically have those 4 stages: enroll, configure, protect, and retire. And that also translates to a corresponding set of features that are listed on the current slide, namely license management, device enrollment, configuration profiles, compliance policies, update rings and policies, and device cleanup rules. So what you see on the left, on the right-hand side is really just represents general life cycle of a device in abstraction of Intune. On the left-hand side, you have a set of Intune-related features which allow you to implement the corresponding functionality. And we'll talk about those features on the left-hand side more later on. Now, similarly, we have the app configuration policies. So if you have app management functionality, and app management functionality ties to application lifecycle. And so that begins when app is added to Intune. And then it progresses through additional phases until you remove the app. So you start by adding the application. That's the first step in the lifecycle. You can actually work with a wide range of different app types. The basic procedure will be roughly the same. There's certainly quite a bit of detail involved in configuring the corresponding applications. So even though, again, the overall workflow is the same, the actual process will be dependent on application type and a corresponding platform. But the bottom line is, with Intune, you can add different app types, including apps that are written in-house, which are referred to as a so-called line of business applications, or LOB. You can add apps from the stores of various mobile device and mobile software vendors. You can also add apps which are accessible via web. So you can basically also accommodate scenarios where you have a client server configuration and you want to install a client for a web server. Next step will be deployment. So after you added an app to an Intune, you can assign it to either users or devices through user and device groups. And then Intune would facilitate the process of deploying the corresponding application. You do have also the ability to monitor the outcome of the deployment, so you can verify that it succeeded. There's also support for adding applications from app stores that involve the use of volume licensing. So you can basically provision applications in bulk for multiple users within your company. Next task within this life cycle is configuration. So Intune would allow you, for example, to facilitate updates to the applications. You also can configure the process of installing the application, so this eliminates potential user errors. In terms of protection, this essentially relies on 2 basic features built into Intune. The first one is conditional access. I mentioned that earlier. That is about controlling access to cloud-based services based on conditions you specify. And those conditions include the device compliance. So you can actually protect the access to your applications depending on the device's state. There's also a way to tie the authorization to the app protection policies. So those policies basically work with individual apps to help protect the company data that they use. For example, you can restrict capping data between unmanaged applications and applications that you manage, or you can prevent apps from running on devices that have been, let's say, jailbroken or rooted. And lastly, we have the retirement. So that essentially means that once the app you deployed become outdated, they would be simply removed. And again, that's easily done by using the uninstall functionality available within Intune. And we'll talk more about the different features that are listed here on the left-hand side, but maybe let's just briefly summarize those so it becomes a bit more clear what this refers to. So the first aspect of it, configuration policy, configuration profiles, these essentially allow you to minimize application setup problems by letting you assign configuration settings to a policy that is assigned to users before they run the server application. So effectively, you'll be able to customize the installation process or assist the user with the installation process in order to eliminate user-side errors. And you can basically do this for iOS, for iPadOS, for Android apps. Those essentially are configuration settings that allow you to modify the installation process in the way that is meant to be used within your organization. App protection policies, I mentioned that before, right? So again, that actually is that brings a value in itself because it allows you to basically separate the corporate data from the personal data. We'll talk much more about later on. App provisioning profiles, these are really meant to be used with the iOS and iPadOS devices. That's attached to the fact that those applications are assigned to iPhones and iPads along with the so-called provisioning profile and the code of the application is signed with the certificate. So essentially when the app is run, the iOS and iPadOS would basically confirm the identity of the corresponding app and enforce the policies that are defined by the provisioning profile. And there's a time limit on that lifetime of the provisioning profile. So this allows you to essentially prevent a situation where the user is not able to run an app because the corresponding provisioning profile expires. Windows S mode, that essentially is the lockdown operating system that only runs store apps. By default, Windows S mode devices do not allow installation and execution of Win32 apps. So essentially what this allows you to do is allows you to provide or integrate those devices with Intune, allowing you to run and install and run Win32 apps on Windows 10 S mode managed devices. We also have support for policy for Office apps. So Intune will basically provide policies specifically for Microsoft Office apps. And you can select specific options to create mobile app management policies for Office mobile apps that connect to Microsoft 365 services. And there's quite a few of those. Let's say you could, for example, for Word, you could turn off protected view for attachments. Let's say with PowerPoint, you could turn off protected view for attachments. So those capabilities are specific to Microsoft 365 Office apps. And this slide gives you a bit of an idea what conditional access is about. So that's one of the important benefits of using MDM for managing devices, because what you can do is you can essentially assess the state of the device, make sure it's compliant with your company's policies, and depending on the outcome of the evaluation, you would allow the corresponding device to access or not the applications, resources within your Azure AD environment. And that actually will be covered in much more detail in the next webinar that deals with 200 level content. So here's an example of what a sample architecture of Microsoft Intune environment look like. So upper right corner, we have the Azure Active Directory with conditional access with Azure Active Directory MFA. That Azure Active Directory is where you define users and groups. That's where you will end up creating corresponding devices or device objects. Within Intune, you would control those three aspects of your environment, namely devices, apps, and data. And with devices, you do it through profiles, you do it through configuration policies, data protection that's tied to app protection policies and device configuration policies. With app management, right? That's essentially where you see the usage of app configuration policies. Once those are in place, at that point you would start enrolling devices, and that's essentially what's represented by that icon of the mobile device at the bottom of the current slide. And what would happen is once you actually enroll the device into Intune, you'll be able to benefit from the functionality that you implemented in those initial steps. On the left-hand side of the slide, you have the web console. So that's connection to your Intune admin center. I mentioned that relies on Graph API. You do have integration with the mobile threat defense vendors that will allow you to assess the state of the device. That will also contribute to the data for compliance calculations. You would be able to gain access to your on-prem environment, assuming that your state, the device state, is up to par to the requirements that company enforces. You also have access to custom web apps, line of business apps, and store apps for Apple App, Google Play, and Microsoft stores. You also gain access to Office 365 applications, so Microsoft 365 applications, as well as SaaS apps in the cloud, which are integrated with Azure Active Directory. Next topic we want to talk about is the integration with Microsoft services and apps. So we actually talked briefly about it earlier on. I mentioned that we're going to explore it in more detail once we start talking about Intune. So that essentially is more about the Intune integration, and it provides a bit more clarity regarding the integration points. So first one, that's the configuration manager. And once again, that quick reminder, that's the on-prem endpoint management solution. You can use essentially the both Intune and configuration manager together in a co-management scenario. You can also use something that's called tenant attach, which allow you to essentially upload device data to Intune and effectively handle some of the tasks available within Intune to manage your on-prem devices. So that brings basically this immediate value by having device records in the cloud and being able to, for example, get real-time data from configuration manager clients, including clients connected from the internet. Next will be Windows Autopilot. Autopilot, that is a way to deliver a modern operating system deployment and provisioning methodology. So with Autopilot, you can provision new devices and send these devices direct to users from an OEM or a device provider. For existing devices, you can re-image those devices to use Windows Autopilot by using Windows Autopilot, and deploy the latest Windows versions. Endpoint analytics, that's the ability to provide more visibility and reporting on end users' experiences, including device performance and reliability. And you can use endpoint analytics to help identify policies or hardware issues that affect device performance. Analytics also would provide some guidance regarding improving the state of those devices. Effectively, you'll be able to minimize the load on your IT support organization. Another integration point is with Microsoft 365. So the idea here is to enhance the end user productivity, focusing on Office apps, including Outlook, Teams, SharePoint, OneDrive, and so on and so on. And using Intune, you can actually deploy those apps to users and devices in a manner we talked about earlier on. You can also deploy those apps to users when the users sign in for the first time. So just-in-time deployment. You also can integrate Intune with Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. And this helps you prevent, detect, investigate, and respond to threats. In particular, you can create a service-to-service connection between Intune and Defender for Endpoint. And once they're connected, you can create policies to scan files, to detect threats, report threat levels to Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. You also can create compliance policies that set an allowable level of risk, and effectively, you can use those afterwards in combination with conditional access to block access to organizational resources for devices which are non-compliant. Next in our list is Autopatch. Autopatch is basically a service that automates the process of managing and rolling out updates for Windows and Microsoft 365 apps. It does require Windows 10, 11, Enterprise E3 or higher to be assigned to users. The same would apply to Azure AD Premium, and Intune is part of it. The goal of Windows Autopatch is basically to deliver software updates to registered devices, effectively freeing up IT and minimizing disruptions to end users. Once the device is registered with the service, Windows Autopatch would basically take on the primary aspects of patch management, including Windows quality, feature updates, Microsoft 365 apps updates, and updates to Edge and Teams. And next, we have the Microsoft Tunnel VPN Gateway. This is a solution for Intune that runs in a container on a Linux device and allows access to on-prem resources from iPad and iPad OS, and Android, using modern authentication and conditional access. So the gateway itself would install as a container and that runs on Linux server. Then the Linux server would be implemented as a physical box in your on-prem environment, or potentially a virtual machine that runs on-prem or in the cloud. And then what you do is you deploy the Defender for Endpoint as the Microsoft Tunnel client app, and Intune VPN profiles to your iOS and Android devices to enable them to use the tunnel to connect to corporate resources. If you decide to host the Linux VM in the cloud, you would also need to implement some sort of hybrid connection, namely either Azure Express Route or site-to-site VPN to extend your on-prem network to the cloud. And lastly, what we have is Azure AD Privileged Identity Management. So that is an Azure Active Directory service which allows you to manage, control, and monitor access to resources in your organization by virtue of providing essentially gated controls to elevation of privileges. So your users can essentially, for the most part, operate using non-privileged accounts. And when they require to perform an admin task, they would be required to elevate their privileges. And that elevation can be potentially controlled through manual approvals, can be automated, but all of the elevations are properly audited, tracked. So that provides extra security and follows the Microsoft Zero Trust strategy. Next, let's talk about integration with third-party services and apps. So that's where you see the usage of managed Google Play, Apple tokens and certificates, and TeamViewer. Managed Google Play account allows admins to access their organization's private store for Android apps and deploy those apps to a user's devices. The equivalent functionality is made available by using Apple tokens and certificates. So this way, once those are added, the iOS and iPad and macOS devices would be enrolled into Intune, which in turn automatically applies the relevant policies to those devices. So admins would be able to essentially access volume purchased iOS and iPad and macOS licenses and deploy those to the corresponding devices. TeamViewer, that essentially is a way to establish or control remote connections to managed devices. And with by combination of these services, right, that Intune would allow you to provide admins with simplified access to third-party partner app services, allow deployments of in bulk of third-party partner apps, and to provide support for obtain support for public retail store apps. This actually includes support for also line of business applications, private, and any apps that are stored in a public store. Now, there's a recent introduction that I gather some of you might have heard of. Actually, this has been in progress for quite a while, but it was finally announced as generally available just about a week ago. And that's the Microsoft Intune suite. The objectives of it is to basically strengthen the integration that we talked about so far, reduce total cost of ownership, but essentially eliminating the need to deal with extend the scope of the management of your devices by using third-party solutions, and also reinforce that zero trust principle I mentioned a moment ago. So effectively, together, the solutions which are part of the Microsoft Intune suite are meant to simplify and centralize tools, enhance the security, and deliver improved end-user experiences. And this includes features such as remote help, Microsoft Tunnel for mobile application management, endpoint privilege management, as well as advanced endpoint analytics, app patching, and packaging. So let's spend a few minutes talking about those different features which are part of the Microsoft Intune suite, starting with remote help. Remote help is a tool that will assist the help desks. This becomes especially important given the fact that the number of remote workers has significantly increased since the beginning of the pandemic. And remote help is already available for Windows users and also be extended to, at some point, to Android and Mac endpoints in the upcoming releases. So that's part of the general release, general availability, and the support for other operating systems is coming. It allows IT help desk teams to remotely troubleshoot a user's desktop and mobile devices based on the user's existing company identity. And the remote help supports a number of features, number of capabilities. Some good portion of those are listed on the current slide. So as you can see, this is controlled at the tenant level. It's available with unenrolled devices. Let's maybe talk briefly about the first one. So by default, Intune tenants are not enabled for remote help. So you can control it at tenant level, make sure that you actually are deciding whether that should be allowed or not. So that would need to happen first before users can be authenticated through your tenant when using remote help. Same would apply to unenrolled support for unenrolled devices. So by default, that's disabled. But you can choose to allow help to devices which are not enrolled with Intune if you decide to do so. Another one is requirement for organizational login. So to use remote help, both the helper and the sharer, the helpee, I guess, would have to sign in with an Azure Active Directory account that is part of your Azure AD tenant. Effectively, you can really use remote help to assist users who are not members of your organization. Compliance warning: before connecting to user's device, a helper would actually see a warning about device not being compliant with the assigned policies. The warning would not block access, but does provide transparency about the risk of using sensitive data, for example, admin credentials during the session. Helpers who have access to device views in Intune will actually see the link in the warning to device properties page in the Intune Admin Center. And this allows the helper to learn more about why device is not compliant. Notice also that unenrolled devices are always reported as non-compliant. And that's sort of the default, intentional default, because obviously there's no way to determine compliance if the device is not enrolled. Next one is role-based access control. So this is controlled by you. You decide who will be able to provide the help to others. You also can determine the helper's access. So you can actually specify which users will be able to help others. You can specify the range of actions they'll be able to perform during the remote help session. For example, you can specify who will be able to run elevated privileges tasks while helping. In addition to that, users, you can specify which users will be able to only view a device, and which ones would be able to request full control of the session while assisting others. And this actually ties to the next bullet point, which talks about elevation of privilege. So when needed, a helper with the correct RBAC permissions would be able to interact with the UAC prompt on the sharer's machine to enter credentials. Lastly, you do have monitoring and auditing capabilities. So in the Intune Admin Center, you'll be able to view reports that include details about who helped who, and you'll be able to see what device was used and for how long. You'll be able to also find details about active sessions. And lastly, just keep in mind, for unenrolled devices, auditing reporting about remote help is somewhat limited. So that's additional consideration to keep in mind if you decide to enable the default behavior, or the behavior which is by default disabled. Next feature, which is part of the Intune suite, is endpoint privilege management. So this one actually happens to be in public preview as of March. Will become generally available, I believe, in sometime in April. And its purpose is to enable the controlled elevation of Windows standard users such that security controls will not interfere with productivity. So effectively, the users would gain write privileges dynamically, eliminating the need to assign those privileges permanently. At the same time, what would happen is that it would eliminate the need for engaging help desk to set up things like, for example, the local printer. Now, with the public preview, at this point, you are able to configure policies for both automatic and user-confirmed workflows to elevate to run tasks with the relevant permissions for apps and processes that you select. And then you can assign these policies to users or devices that have end users running without admin privileges. Once the policy is received, endpoint privilege management would broker the elevation on behalf of the user, allowing them to elevate approved applications without needing full admin privileges. And the preview also includes built-in insights and reporting for this specific functionality. Next feature, which is called Advanced Endpoint Analytics, as the name indicates, is built on top of Endpoint Analytics. So some of the features which are included in the Advanced Endpoint Analytics allow you to or include support for custom device scopes. So you can use scope tags to essentially divide endpoint analytics reports to a subset of devices. This allows you to view scores, insights, and recommendations which are specific to a subset of enrolled devices. Let's say devices that belong to a specific business group or assigned to a specific geographical region. Another is anomaly detection, which allows you to essentially leverage the cloud intelligence and machine learning capabilities in order to detect or basically monitor health devices and detect any changes that might indicate something potentially malicious. Enhanced device timeline that gives you more events, lower data latency typically in case of troubleshooting scenarios. So those commonly come into play where you want to determine what potentially might trigger an issue with the device. This will give you an indication of what actually happened to the device over a specific period of time. Notice that this is available only for Intune managed devices, right? So in this case, there's no support for co-management scenarios. And next one, we have Microsoft Tunnel for mobile app management. And that essentially is, I guess, so to speak, micro VPN that connects corporate resources from personal iOS, iPadOS, and Android devices. So this way, users who are using those devices will have access to the company's resources in a more consistent manner, or a transparent manner. So effectively, when you use the Microsoft Tunnel VPN gateway, you can extend the tunnel support by adding this particular functionality. So with this solution, essentially users would use a single device that hasn't enrolled with Intune to gain secure access to organizations' on-prem apps and resources by using modern authentication. And this includes support for single sign-on and conditional access. Next, we have support for special devices. This is relatively straightforward. Basically, what this indicates that you do have the ability to use Intune in order to manage devices which previously were out of scope, namely a large smart screen devices over 30 inches in size, augmented reality and virtual reality headsets, wearable headsets, conference room meeting devices. What's not in scope here are laptops and tablet devices, foldable messaging devices, mobile devices extensions, such for example wearables or watches, where the data is managed through mobile apps in iOS and Android mobile phones. There's no support in this case for IoT devices or devices that are included in plans for frontline workers. The next feature is the advanced app management. Now, this is really more of a promise because that is meant to be added following the launch on GA announced on March 1st. But basically what this is meant to provide is the enterprise app catalog and controls to simplify app discovery, deployment, and automatic updating to mitigate risks associated with using out-of-date apps. So I guess to be seen what exactly this will entail, but just going to be aware of the fact that this is coming in not too distant future. And lastly, we also have support for certificate management. So this is also currently not yet part of the GA release from the March 1st. This is essentially meant to facilitate management of VPN and Wi-Fi certificates from Intune to devices without on-prem infrastructure. So this will essentially include a number of endpoint security features, automation, control that are meant to enhance the security in scenarios that involve VPN and Wi-Fi connectivity. Okay, so this actually concludes our first slide deck for the session. Let me actually take a quick look at the questions in a chat, and let's try to address those. So maybe let's start from the bottom. Okay, so these specific devices include MS HoloLens and Teams phones. So those are, I don't believe so. Yeah, I don't believe these are actually in scope. Next one, can we add Windows servers to Intune in order to manage via Microsoft Defender for endpoint AV? Yeah, I'm not aware of support for Windows Server in Intune. So are you, Scott, I'm sure you are in position to talk, but are you actually getting indication from Microsoft that we supported by Intune? Yes and no conflicting. Okay, so I'd love to see some details regarding this because again, in general, Windows servers are out of scope when dealing with Intune. You do have other ways of implementing endpoint on Windows servers, though, as you might be aware, right? I guess if you're talking about on-prem environment, right, that would be implemented either through Defender 365 or potentially if you have Azure in a picture, you might do this by relying on Azure Arc, right? Azure Arc actually will allow you to Defender for Cloud along with Azure Arc, right? So that essentially at this point, Defender for Cloud integrates with endpoint as well. So there are a couple ways to deal with it outside of Intune scenario. But again, if you intend to use Intune to manage the corresponding servers, I don't believe that's an option, right? That basically would imply a co-management, right? If you basically use the somehow integrate Intune with your on-prem environment, that will involve using the on-prem, using the co-management. Correct. Yes. So you can actually, so if you use Windows 10, Windows 11 as your Azure Virtual Desktop hosts, you do have the ability to manage those through Intune as well. I'm looking basically at the comment from the question from Tim, right? So really dependent. That's sort of dependent on what is your Azure Virtual Desktop host OS platform. So I'm looking at another question from Tim. What if organization has no Win ID, just Azure AD? So that's certainly not a problem, right? In other words, that's sort of the actually recommended model for scenarios like Intune for Microsoft in general, right? So it's really, the end goal is to eliminate the dependency on Active Directory and implement all the functionality that's needed by an organization by using Azure Active Directory. Obviously, very few companies actually reach that point. But the bottom line is, if there's a company like that, which just purely Azure AD in a picture, that certainly wouldn't represent a problem or constitute a problem from the Intune implementation standpoint. I have a question from Arnaud. So embedded devices are represented in which of the 3 Azure AD device identity scenarios? So really, ultimately, it will really depend on the capability of the device itself, right? So the question would be whether the device supports Azure AD join, whether it supports Azure AD registration. I wouldn't expect this to be part of the hybrid model, but what you can do with those in terms of integration with Azure AD would really depend on the functionality built into that embedded device. So it could be case-by-case basis. Okay, maybe let's do the following. So it's about 11:30 Central. So let's take a 15-minute break. The break was actually meant to be, I think, meant to be scheduled a bit later. But I think, given the fact we finished the first deck, it might make sense for us to take a bit at this point and resume with the next one after the break. So let's start at 11:45, basically in about 15 minutes from now, and I'll continue presentation of the second deck of the webinar. Thank you very much, and I'll talk to you afterwards. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Let's continue with the second deck of the presentation, which is about planning for and deploying Microsoft Intune. Can you just confirm for me you can see the slides, you can hear me okay? Okay, thanks so much. So the basic premise behind this slide deck is to essentially take you through at the high level. Again, keep in mind it's level 100. So take you through the steps you would go through in order to implement Microsoft Intune in your environment. So it's not really meant to provide kind of a very in-depth overview of different features listed here. It's really more about understanding what typically would be the workflow of the deployment process and what should be taken into account when deploying Intune in an organization. So we'll start with planning for Microsoft Intune. We'll talk about configuring endpoint security next. Next, we'll talk about deploying apps, implementing the device compliance, enrolling devices, and lastly, assessing device compliance. Let's start with planning. So the current slide gives you a listing of high-level steps that you'd want to consider as part of planning process. Those effectively translate into actionable tasks. So each one of those represents essentially some sort of action you need to take eventually to implement Intune. But let's start with the planning for it. So we'll talk about dependencies. We'll talk about setting up an Intune subscription, identifying, adding, configuring, and protecting apps, setting up compliance policies and conditional access, configuring device features and settings, enrolling devices, and lastly, validating the resulting implementation. The idea is basically to make sure that you don't enroll devices first, right? That's sort of the last step of the process. You want to make sure you build your secure infrastructure using Intune in a way that will actually protect those devices once they're enrolled, and you don't unintentionally enroll devices which are misconfigured or not properly protected, effectively jeopardizing your environment. So let's start with implementing dependencies. In terms of requirements, there's really one hard requirement here, the one we mentioned earlier on. You have to have an Azure Active Directory tenant, and that tenant should be configured in a way that actually will contain all relevant users, devices, and groups. So depending on your environment, this might entail, for example, setting up an Azure AD Connect, or again, otherwise, if you operate cloud only, then that will be simpler. It will just involve you actually making sure tenants in place. You might want to, typically what you'll do is as part of the tenant setup, you will also assign a name, assign and verify the name, custom name to your Azure AD tenant. So you wouldn't have the default name ending with on-microsoft.com. You'd have basically a name that represents your corporate identity. In addition to that, there might be a set of other requirements or prerequisites which depend on the type of devices you want to support. In particular, for iOS, iPadOS, and macOS, for device enrollments for those devices, you would need to make sure you have an Apple MDM push certificate. We'll talk more about later on. Similarly, you would need to have managed Google Play account for Android apps. Now, beyond that, those dependencies also include some recommended, optional, but recommended services and features. In particular, if you intend to use conditional access in order to protect your environment, that's not Intune specific, by the way. It's really more about the feature which provides you with this enhanced authorization mechanism. Then you need to have Azure AD Premium licensing, right? Basically, you need to have P1 at least to implement conditional access. MFA is available actually with the secure default, but given the fact we want to actually advanced or enhanced scenarios supported, that would also entail having Azure AD Premium in place. Another benefit of using Azure AD Premium in the context of working with Microsoft Intune is support for dynamic groups. With dynamic groups, basically what you can do is you can create groups to which membership is updated dynamically based on the criteria you specify. So let's say you have a number of departments, you want to actually have groups that represent either users or devices that are purchased, owned by a specific department. You can do it by relying on dynamic groups by checking the department attribute associated with the user account or computer account, and they'll basically automatically add the user to the corresponding group. This obviously ties to the provisioning process. The provisioning process will need to account for the fact that you are using dynamic groups, but that's probably a bit more less effort intensive than trying to continually update group membership yourself. In addition to that, another recommended dependency would be a Microsoft 365 subscription due to the features which are commonly used with Intune, so provisioning productivity apps, and in addition to that, Windows Autopilot-based enrollment. Next step in our planning / implementation procedure is setting up an Intune subscription. That seems rather obvious. There are some caveats regarding this. So you'd want to, for one, review the support configurations. So you should review the device platforms and operating system that Intune supports. Same would apply to making sure that you have sufficient network bandwidth regarding that would allow the installation updates of by using Microsoft Intune, depending on how your clients are set up. That would involve signing up for Intune. The details really are more of a commercial nature, so that potentially might tie to having an enterprise agreement with Microsoft, some other equivalent volume licensing agreement. And effectively, once you sign up for Microsoft Intune, right, that actually by default implies you would have Azure AD account in place, Azure AD tenant in place. That ties to that aspect of assigning custom domain name, which I mentioned earlier on. So by default, when you create an Azure AD tenant, the tenant would have the suffix ending with or consisting of the onmicrosoft.com. So what you would typically do in order to make sure that the tenant and the user principal names that you create represent your corporate identity, you'd want to set up a custom domain name that would basically work in addition to onmicrosoft.com. So going forward, you'll be able to use the usernames that end with that suffix that ties to your domain name that you own, as opposed to using the default one. That's optional. So again, if you actually simply want to evaluate Intune, you can certainly skip that step and rely on the default domain name. The next step would be to add users to Intune. And effectively what this really implies is that, or what this means, translates to, is the fact you're going to be creating user accounts in Azure Active Directory tenant, in the tenant, which is linked to your Intune subscription. So those accounts need to exist in Azure Active Directory. Beyond that, you would also want to make sure that you authorize those accounts to work within Intune. So if you have some admin accounts, you want to be able to provide permissions to Intune, you'll need to rely on RBAC role-based access controller roles within Intune to do so. And also keep in mind this also ties to licensing. So in addition to provisioning accounts, you also need to make sure that the accounts that you want to be able to both work with and use Intune, or manage and use Intune, those accounts will need to be assigned proper licenses. Another aspect of it would be to create groups that you want to use throughout Intune in order to perform management of users groups and applications. For the most part, what you implement in Intune ties to or is assigned to groups, not users or devices. So effectively, you want to provide more granularity regarding targets of particular policies or profiles. Within Intune, we need to correspond to the groups you create within the Azure AD tenant, and effectively also those groups should have licensed users assigned to them if they're user groups. What you can actually do, you can rely on dynamic groups for this as well, and also you can use dynamic groups in order to assign licenses to users as well. So licensing can be handled on a group level as opposed to individual user level. And Intune is available from the licensing standpoint. Intune is available with different subscriptions, including as a standalone service. So you'd want to evaluate properly those options and determine the licensing service or licensing approach that will be optimal for your organization. Next step would be to manage roles and grant unlimited permissions to Intune. That goes back to the topic I mentioned earlier on. You'd want to make sure that you assign proper permissions to the users that will be both managing and using Intune-related functionality. Microsoft Intune actually includes a set of admin roles that you can assign to users in your organization, and that can be done simply by using the Microsoft Intune Admin Center. And each admin role would map to a common business function that would provide the corresponding grantees permissions to do specific tasks within the admin center. And you actually can use both the built-in roles and custom roles. So if the built-in roles are not sufficient for your needs, you also have the option of creating custom roles and using those instead. Next step is setting up the mobile device management authority. Now, there's a bit of a nuance here. So actually, that's changed over the years. At this point, if you work with Intune exclusively, then that authority will be automatically set to Intune. That would change or differ if we were to use the basic option we discussed earlier in the context of Microsoft 365. But we'll talk more about this in a moment. And lastly, one additional thing you might want to consider doing is customizing the Intune company portal. So there's some customization options available to you. Common tasks, you might want to basically customize the interface so the most commonly performed tasks would be featured more prominently in the interface. And the corresponding settings will essentially appear in the portal app that you customize would affect the interface provided by the company portal app and the Intune company portal website. This should ring a bell. So that's really resembles or close related to the slide we talked about in the first slide deck prior to lunch. Krista, you might want to mute yourself. So we basically have those two features, MDM and MAM. We talked about those initially in the context of management of devices and apps, abstract without specific Intune angle to it. Both features are supported with Intune. So Intune supports both MDM and MAM. Notice that in this case, not surprisingly, MDM would require device enrollment. So for you to be able to manage devices, those devices have to be enrolled into Intune. This effectively gives you the control of the entire device, includes support for applying configuration settings and rules. And most commonly, you would see the usage of MDM in the context of corporate-owned devices. MAM, that eliminates the need to implement device enrollment. It provides access to control of apps. It relies heavily on the app protection policies to do so. And most commonly, although again, not exclusively, would be used on personal devices. So there's certain benefit to combine MDM and MAM on corporate-owned devices. So if you were to go with MAM model only, that potentially will be something you might experience or you might encounter more commonly on personal devices. But typically in the context of corporate environments, you would see the use of both MDM and MAM. Now, in terms of terminology, you would see those terms being used throughout the documentation for Intune. So MDM and MAM are certainly terms that that are being used in the concept of Intune as well. In abstraction of, I guess, without referring to general methodology, it's really Intune specific approaches are also referred to as MDM and MAM. Yeah, what you might see actually when you combine MAM with MDM, you actually might see this referred to as MAM plus MDM. And And the basic idea is to make sure that when you combine the two, you actually provide protection for both devices and applications on the device. So there are certain benefits to using MDM with app protection policies. And as I mentioned, companies would typically use both at the same time. So let's talk briefly about choosing the MDM authority. And we have effectively those four options available to us. There's Intune standalone, Intune co-management, basic mobility, and security for Microsoft 365. And we have coexistence between basic mobility and security for Microsoft 365 and Intune. And the choice would effectively determine which service is being used for device management. This translates into corresponding interface and which service is being used by devices to send their data to. So ultimately, the MDM essentially determines how you manage your devices. And again, depending on the scenario, you might or might not be in a position where you need to set the MDM authority. The first one which essentially applies to typical scenario where you stand up Intune in absence of other management options. In other words, if you don't have configuration manager, if you are you not using basic mobility and security for Microsoft 365, you would end up with Intune standalone. And as a result, you'll be managing the MDM and MAM functionality directly from the Intune admin center. Co-management, we talked about earlier on, that basically involves you combining configuration manager in your on-prem environment with Intune for cloud-based management. And this allows you essentially to leverage the functionality of Intune to provide management for Windows 10 and 11 devices. And in terms of management, right, it's not entirely true, actually. Management can be distributed between configuration manager console and Intune. Like we talked about cloud attach as one of the options, which allows you to basically upload the device data into Intune, at which point you will be able to perform some tasks from the Intune admin console. But effectively, you start with configuration manager and you decide which tasks should be performed by using which tool. So there's a way basically to provide flexibility in terms of division of responsibilities between the two management environments. Next one is basic mobility and security for Microsoft 365. If you have this configuration activated, you actually see the MDM authority being set to Office 365. And if you want to start using Intune, you basically need to purchase Intune licenses and assign them to the users that you want to be able to manage by using Intune. So that essentially translates into having coexistence between the two, between basic mobility and security and Intune. So effectively, in this scenario, each user's management authority would be defined based on the license assigned to the user. In other words, if a user has only a license for Microsoft 365 Basic and Standard, their device will be managed by using Basic Mobility and Security for Microsoft 365. If the user has a license entitling Intune, then their devices will be managed by Intune. If you actually add an Intune license to a user who was previously managed by Basic Mobility and Security for Microsoft 365, then their device will be switched to Intune management. So what's important to keep in mind in this context is the fact that if you decide to do so, you want to make sure you do have proper configuration on the Intune side assigned to the users that will effectively sufficiently replace the settings configured by using Basic Mobility Security for 365 before switching users to Intune. Otherwise, those settings would lose the settings assigned through or configuration assigned through basic mobility and security, and won't receive any replacement from Intune. So there's certainly additional consideration to keep in mind here in terms of the transitioning from one to the other. And you will notice if you try Intune at this point, if you basically start anew by implementing Intune, you will notice that Intune actually will automatically set the authority to itself when you implement it. So there's really no configuration option to change it, which also implies that if you want to implement combination or coexistence between basic and Intune, you can actually first implement basic and then transition or add Intune to it. Something was mentioned briefly in the first slide deck. So once we have the core components in place, basically we have the underlying Intune environment set, the next step would be to identify, add, configure, and protect apps. Managing applications on devices is a core piece of a secure and productive enterprise ecosystem. And that essentially is one of the features that Microsoft Intune provides. This allows you to control which apps your company uses. You also can specify configuration of those apps, and you can include their protection. So that's essentially what we refer to in essence by mobile application management. But keep in mind that some of the functionality will tie to or will depend on whether the device has been enrolled into Intune as well. So even though ultimately, I guess this sits under the MAM umbrella, the set of features you can implement is dependent to some extent on whether the device is enrolled into Intune or not. So in case of MAM, an Intune is designed to protect the data for the applications at the application level. It also supports creation of custom apps, supports addition and deployment of store apps. It can be applied to both personal and organizational owned devices. When used with personal devices, the scope would be limited to apps or to data that it belongs to the managed apps or apps managed by MAM. And there's actually a term that's being used in this case, that's the MAM without enrollment, or MAM-WE. From the user's perspective, they will be commonly referred to as the BYOD, bring your device. And the purpose of MAM in the context of Intune and in general is to make sure that you actually provide the separation between the company data and personal data. That's kind of one of the features of MAM. It's certainly not the only one, but ultimately you want to make sure that if you operate in environments where users are potentially using both personal devices and company-owned devices, right? On the personal devices, you want to make sure that the data stays protected. By the way, also another piece of information to keep in mind, there's actually support for using MAM from Intune with third-party enterprise mobility management providers. So the use of MAM doesn't necessarily imply, in this context, doesn't necessarily imply that you have to use MDM from Intune. You can potentially use third-party providers on the device management side, but in terms of the integration, obviously, it will be optimal to use both at the same time. So some of the functionality that you can implement in this context, if you look at basically the current slide, of some of the steps you need to configure and some of the features that correspond to steps is adding line of business apps, adding Microsoft apps, adding store apps. You want to make sure that you have supported app types that you actually intend to, the apps you intend to deploy are supported fully by Intune. For each one of those, you want to identify the licensing requirements. And you could use basically features which allow you to both configure and protect apps. And essentially that translates into implementing so-called app configuration policies and app protection policies, respectively. And those policies can, for example, entail enforcing the use of PIN to open an application in the work context. They can entail blocking managed apps from running on devices which are either jailbroken or rooted. They can involve control sharing of data between apps, or prevent saving the company's app data to a personal storage location. Next step involves setting up compliance policies and conditional access. So in the previous steps, you set up your Intune subscription, you created app protection policy. Next, the plan involves configuring device compliance settings and policies that will protect organizational data by requiring devices to meet specific set of requirements. And you deploy those in the form of compliance policies. You deploy those by targeting devices and users. When you deploy this to users, any device that the user signs in would need to meet the policy requirements. If you deploy devices related to effectively target specific device, regardless of the users signing in to the device. And those would commonly include requirements such as, for example, a minimum OS version, using a specific complexity password or PIN, device being at certain so-called threat level, as determined by your mobile threat defense software you're using. This actually includes support for Defender for endpoint, or potentially the use of the third-party partners that Intune integrates with. If the device failed to meet requirements for the compliance policy, then you also have the option of invoking one or more actions for non-compliance. And those actions can include, for example, remote locking of the non-compliant device, sending an email notification to a device, to the user's device about the compliance issue. So this way the user can bring that device back into compliance. Also, this can identify potential devices which are ready to be retired if they remain out of compliance for an extended period of time. So this might help you essentially minimize the risk by making sure that you don't run devices, don't use devices, don't allow devices which are simply not supporting a specific set of standards. There's also grace period. So grace period basically would determine how long the device can remain non-compliant, or how long the compliance setting actually is being retained by the device. In addition to that, when you have to work with compliance, you typically might want to set up different compliance levels. Again, it's not mandatory, it's optional. And the levels that are listed here are just meant to represent just general guidelines of best practices provided by Microsoft. But you might essentially want to make sure you establish different levels of compliance, and then you assign those different levels of compliance through policies depending on the target environment. So some devices might be used for actions which are not necessarily requiring more security. That might be part of your baseline. You might create another level, enhanced level, which would include settings which apply to devices which are used in more secure environments. So those, for example, involve encryption or set system level file protections. And another one would be advanced device compliance configurations, those that require deeper integration with products such as, for example, Azure AD conditional access. So now we are the next step. This deals with the configuration of devices. More specifically, we want to control features and settings on those devices. This applies to essentially all the supported Intune platforms, so Android, iOS, iPadOS, macOS, Windows. And when you create configuration profiles, that essentially is done by using so-called configuration profiles. When you create those configuration profiles, there are different levels, different types of policies available. And again, if you were to follow Microsoft recommendations, you might want to set those up into, or divide those into different levels. So level 1 would represent a minimum device configuration. That would focus on device security, including installation of antivirus, creating a strong password policy, and installation of software updates. That would allow, for example, users to access their organization's email and provide controlled secure access to your network. Next level, it will represent the enhanced device configuration. It will entail expanding device security, including configuring disk encryption and enabling secure boot, and adding more password rules. Next, actually within this category, so we would also use some of the built-in features and templates to configure more settings that might be important to your organization, including, for example, analyzing the outcome of applying on-premises GPOs, right? So in hybrid scenarios that potentially might entail translating the GPO functionality which exists on-prem into the functionality that you want to implement for cloud-based workloads, for cloud-based devices. And lastly, we have the advanced device configuration. And that basically would entail kind of more advanced features that potentially might be limited to just subset of devices. This can mean moving to passwordless authentication, including certificates, configuring single sign-on, enabling multi-factor authentication, and configuring Microsoft Tunnel we talked about earlier on. You also might want to add an extra layer of security using Android common criteria mode. So that would apply to Android devices. You would have similar policies through DFCI for Windows. You might want to use built-in features to configure kiosk devices, dedicated devices, shared devices, and other specialized devices. You also have the option of implementing shell scripts. So for example, you can deploy PowerShell script that will provide more flexibility in terms of configuration of the target devices. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Intune, you might realize actually there are multiple ways to implement this. So in general, there are basically two main categories that come into play here. The first one is configuration profile. Configuration profiles essentially are meant to enforce certain settings. They are geared towards configuration settings which are not necessarily focusing on security. If you want to implement secure-related settings in this context, you might want to start with using endpoint security. Endpoint security includes security baselines and templates that simplify implementing those levels that I mentioned here according to Microsoft best practices. The tricky part is that actually you might see a combination of both coming to play. So you need to be aware of the potential conflicts. But that's really more of a 200 level aspect. So for the time being, just keep in mind, there are several different ways of implementing this. In general, it can be done through so-called configuration profiles, can be done through security baselines. And also you can use templates within endpoint security to deliver specific set of features which are security focused. Okay, so this is essentially the next step in the deployment process that you want to plan for. And that's enrollment of the devices. That's essentially kind of our final phase of deployment, in which devices are first registered in or joined to Azure Active Directory. They can be actually enrolled into Microsoft Intune at the same time. So there's a way to basically tie the process of registering and joining Azure AD with enrollment into Intune. That certainly provides additional convenience, but it does require licensing on the Azure AD side. Either way, what's going to happen is at that point, right, once the device is registered in Azure AD or joined to Azure AD, basically there's an object representing the device in Azure AD. What would happen is during enrollment, Microsoft Intune would basically install a mobile device management certificate on the device, which would allow Intune to essentially apply the corresponding profiles, enrollment. They would allow you to enforce enrollment restrictions and apply the policies and profiles that you created previously. So effectively, you by virtue of you enrolling the device into Intune, you effectively apply everything you configured previously to ensure that the device itself stays secure and is fully managed. If you do it in a production environment, well, if you do it basically in an environment that actually is kind of real life, it's not a test environment that you use to evaluate Intune, you would want to consider using a staged approach, right? So start with a small pilot. There's certainly plenty of flexibility in terms of how to do it, in terms of building different stages of your deployment. As I mentioned, that essentially is done typically based on in terms of the application of the policies profiles, and that's done on a per group basis. You can control the same enrollment scope by using group-based approach as well. So even with automated enrollment, that can be fully controlled by using group membership. So the advice would be make sure that you actually do have that stage rollout plan in order to make sure that you identify any potential issues with your deployment process. So you would basically you could assign an enrollment profile to a pilot or a test group, and then after initial testing, you would be able to add more users to the pilot group. If everything goes well, then you would assign enrollment profile to more pilot groups, or to basically add the users to the same pilot group. Either way would essentially result in pretty much the same outcome. In terms of the pre-enrollment configurations, there's basically a set of settings you might want to consider to configure prior to enrollment beyond the ones we talked about earlier on. In particular, you have a number of considerations that apply to devices that were previously enrolled into other MDM providers. So you want to make sure that those devices are unenrolled from the existing MDM provider before enrolling them into Intune. Other type of pre-enrollment settings you might want to consider is specifying enrollment restrictions. We'll talk about those later on. For example, you can specify how many devices a given user can enroll into Intune. So you can set those limits to values different than defaults. By default, it's 5. You can implement device categorization. So this way you actually can relatively easily distinguish between devices, let's say from different departments or from different locations, geographic locations. You can implement so-called device enrollment managers. And the idea is basically to delegate the ability to enroll devices to designated personnel. There'll be typically somebody from IT who would be able to enroll devices on behalf of users. We'll talk more about this later on, but basically in this case, you'd essentially eliminate the need for users to deal with enrollment. You handle it for them and simply hand over the devices already enrolled into Intune. Another one, which is fairly straightforward, is the terms and conditional policies. Those essentially will allow you to display the terms and conditions form that users need to acknowledge before they enroll their devices. And lastly, the last piece that potentially might make sense is to enforce multi-factor authentication. So this way, users need to authenticate through MFA before they are allowed to enroll their devices. So this provides an extra level of security. The last piece of the process will be to validate the resulting implementation. And Intune includes a number of features that help you monitor and manage your device configuration profiles, your compliance policies, and device status. For example, you can check the status of a profile, see which devices are assigned, and update the properties of the profile. There's a set of compliance reports that you can generate directly from the admin interface of Intune. So that will allow you to identify devices that fail to meet your specific compliance policies. Would help you identify compliance-related issues in your organization. And effectively, you can fairly quickly determine what potentially might be an impact on your managed environment of a given non-compliance device. Regarding monitoring device status, notice that you can actually leverage integration between Intune and Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. So effectively, when you integrate the tool, you'll be able to actually use the information of device compliance and onboarding in both Intune Admin Center and Defender for Endpoint interfaces, right? So we go to Microsoft Defender 365 console to determine that. So let's actually talk in a bit more detail about those different settings that you potentially might control as part of your deployment plan or configured as part of your deployment plan. So let's start with the MDM settings. Essentially, with Intune, you can manage multiple devices per person, and the different platforms that run on each device, including Android, iPadOS, Linux, macOS, and Windows. And Intune essentially separates policies and settings by device platform, so it becomes fairly easy to manage those, manage specific set of devices based on the corresponding device platform, OS platform. There is a set of organizational-wide setting. Those allow you to allow or block specific unsupported MDM devices. Device security policies could include, for example, the requirement for encrypted backups, could block such features as cloud backup, could block document synchronization, screen captures, video conference, sending diagnostics data, access to App Store, and connections to remote storage, or for example, Bluetooth connections. So these are some of the settings you have to control by using the functionality built into the compliance policies in Intune. And as we mentioned, there's the settings you can actually control are these is a collection, a combination of the settings that are available in the basic mobility security model, along with additional settings that are Intune only. And so this slide gives you basic indication which one of those represent the core settings which are available in both versus those which are exclusive to Intune. So as far as just one more comment regarding this, as far as the first one, organization-wide device settings, those allow you to control device platforms, allow you to specify access controls, and allow you to also control the target client apps. Here's additional set of setup tasks that you might want to incorporate into your deployment plan. So we talked about those that essentially would be highly recommended by Microsoft. There's a set of additional ones that tie to deployments, tie to enrollment, but some of these might be, for example, platform specific. So let's talk about those for a few minutes. Those would typically take place after you configure MDM authority in Intune, and potentially activate the MDM service for Microsoft 365. And those should take place also before you start enrolling devices into Intune. And as I mentioned, their significance or their relevance depends on the device platform. It also depends on the enrollment methodology. So the first one, this list on the right-hand side, is configuring domains for MDM. Next one, configuring an APN certificate for iOS devices. Next one is the setup multi-factor authentication that actually came up earlier on as well. Next one, implementing device security policies, and last one is define device enrollment policies. So let's talk briefly about setting up MFA. As I mentioned, this would essentially leverage the Azure AD Premium capabilities. So even though MFA is available with secure defaults in Azure AD, that's not the context in which this is presented. In this case, we want to make sure we actually can control this in larger scope, where conditional access policies would come into play, and that requires Azure AD Premium. And basically, this means that effectively, when users attempt to register or enroll their devices into Intune, they would need to authenticate, and as part of authentication, right, they also need to satisfy a specific set of requirements defined by conditional access. So during enrollment, they will be basically prompted for the second form of authentication. Next set of requirements that we might want to put in place prior to enrollment involve implementing security policies. And there's a number of ways to implement those. We can use for this purpose device configuration policies, device configuration profiles. We can implement those by using endpoint security profiles and policies. We can, as I mentioned, you can use the endpoint protection security baselines. You can also leverage for this conditional access policies and device compliance policies. There is a bit more granularity when it comes to implementation of the endpoint security policy types. So there's essentially a set of, these represent collection of settings which control different aspects of security on a device. So those include antivirus, disk encryption, firewall, endpoint detection response, attack surface reduction, and account protection. That becomes actually fairly evident once you start looking at the interface, but just review quickly each one of those. So antivirus, that essentially allow you to leverage the antivirus settings for managed devices. Disk encryption allows you to enforce the built-in encryption methods, such as, let's say, BitLocker or File Vault. And again, the focus here is to make sure that admins, Intune admins, can essentially manage those settings without having to navigate a host of unrelated settings. So the policy types focus on those specific set of features only. Firewall, that's about the always built-in firewall configuration. That applies to Windows 10, 11, that applies to Mac OS. Endpoint detection and response, that leverages the integration between Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and Intune. So you can essentially use the endpoint security policies for endpoint detection and response to manage the security of the device. And next, we have the attack surface reduction. So in this case, the settings apply to Windows 10, 11 devices. And lastly, we have account protection. That ties to the settings that are concerning Windows Hello and Credential Guard. So that's part of the Windows Identity Access Management. Next set of settings deal with the corporate device enrollment policy. So those I mentioned earlier on. In this case, what you can do, you can set the policy at the tenant level, at the Intune subscription level, in order to control the number of devices that a user can enroll into. And we can specify device platforms which are supported. We also can specify the required OS versions for iOS, Android, and Windows. Android should be only once there. Sorry about that. And note that the restrictions do apply to not just corporate owned, but also personal devices. So once we have those defined, the next step would be essentially to proceed with the implementation. So let's step through this. This is kind of meant to emulate a whiteboard session in a bit more organized manner. So if you look at the current slide, this essentially gives you the starting point. We effectively have the devices. In this case, they can be personal, can be corporate owned. We want to be able to manage them through Intune. So we start with the state where we do have an Azure AD tenant. This Azure AD tenant, in our case, actually would be integrated with Active Directory on-prem, since we do have on-prem network likely. That's not really not represented by the current slide, but something we talked about earlier on. So just in this case, right, if there's AD on-prem, you'd want to make sure you integrate that first with Azure Active Directory tenant you have in place. Next, you would add users and groups to your Azure AD tenant. Next step would be to implement Intune. And once the Intune is implemented, once you basically create a subscription, once you provision a subscription, you'd gain access to it through the Admin Center web console, and it'll allow you to apply configuration and obtain reporting information from Intune by relying on Graph API. Next step would be to implement those 3 different set of features that protect devices, data, and apps. And this translates essentially into creating device configuration profiles, translates into creating app protection policies on the data side, and creating app configuration policies on the app side. Again, this is not really full functionality, obviously, but there's just general set of rules you'd follow as part of the implementation steps. Another component you'd want to implement is conditional access and Azure AD MFA. So it allows you to protect your resources from the Azure AD side. As you might recall, that would require premium licensing. Next, you would enroll the device into Intune. So that's enrollment part as part of a. This actually includes both enrollment and joining the device to, or registering device in Azure AD. So at this point, we do have an object representing the device in Azure AD. We also, at the same time, we can actually do it at the same time. We also can enroll the device into Intune. So this is a combination of two steps. They can be combined together. They can be essentially tied together automatically. They can be performed separately, but ultimately at that point, once those actions are completed, you would end up with a device which is enrolled into Azure AD, and there's corresponding device object created in the Azure AD tenant. Now, as the result of enrollment, the device itself would apply locally the policies defined in Intune, would provide the corresponding data representing device status, and that will be essentially collected, reported to the cloud. And along the way, you also can rely on that mobile threat defense connector, which provides the integration with third-party MTD providers in order to deliver the additional compliance data to the cloud. That will also allow us to implement network access control mechanisms, for example, in order to provide access to on-prem network. So there's integration, which we really didn't talk about, with network access control providers that can read the device compliance information from the cloud and determine whether the device should be allowed to access your on-prem environment as well. And as part of the application provisioning process, right, you would provide access to cloud-based applications such as custom web apps, online business apps, SaaS apps in the cloud, and Office 365 apps to the device as well. And lastly, another piece that we really didn't talk about earlier on, there's a way to essentially provide the information about the data usage on the telco side. So you'll be able to actually report that to the cloud as well if you want to have more visibility into the usage of the telco providers. So this actually concludes the planning part. And again, we actually did quite a bit. We did talk quite a bit about the implementation pieces of it as well. So this is not exclusively planning, but hopefully give you an idea what essentially is involved in setting up Intune. Now we're going to get into a bit more detail, but I'm just hoping that what you've seen so far makes sense from the high-level perspective. Okay, so let's talk next about configuring endpoint security. And that entails using basically the designated node within the Intune admin center. So if you look at the interface on the right-hand side, the screenshot of the interface, right, that essentially gives you an indication of what would that involve. So once you select endpoint security, you will have access essentially to all the features you see on the right-hand side of that screenshot. And essentially endpoint security policies, so this entail using endpoint security policies. The idea behind the policies is to help organizations focus on the security of their devices and mitigate the corresponding risks. So the intention is to, for one, identify any at-risk devices, remediate those devices, and effectively, as the result, bring them back into the compliance state. Now, this actually involves two types of features. The first one is the actual endpoint security policy, which is mentioned on this slide. Another one involves the use of so-called security baselines. And we'll talk about both of these in the context of the slides within this section. In general, the endpoint security node in the admin center is meant to group the tools that are available through Intune that will help you to keep your devices secure. And as I mentioned, there's a bit of an overlap between the security policies and configuration profiles. So when you work with security policy, you might want to keep those in mind and make sure that you actually follow recommendations regarding how to handle those potential conflicts. So in general, you would actually start with endpoint security. You would target the settings which are security focused from here, and then any remaining gaps you would cover by using configuration profiles. Now, besides the ability to create security profiles, again, if you take a quick look at the screenshot, you might essentially deduct that in addition to the security policies, you will be able to also review the status of all managed devices. So if you go to all devices, if you go to devices and then navigate to all devices, you'll be able to find the compliance for devices from a high level. So if you look at the right-hand side, right, on the right-hand side, you have the all devices menu item. They will provide you with the high-level overview of the device compliance for all devices. Then you can drill down to specific devices, which would help you understand which compliance policies are not met by a given device and effectively resolve them. Next one in line is security baseline. So that's what I mentioned a moment ago. That essentially is the listing of the settings that are meant to represent Microsoft best practices for different scenarios, different environments. We'll take a closer look at those in a moment. We also have the listing of the ability to create endpoint security policies, which focus on specific aspects of device security. We talked about those briefly earlier on. So as you might recall, they include antivirus settings, disk encryption settings, firewalls, and several other areas that provide integration with Defender for Endpoint. We also have the ability to implement compliance policies. So these policies essentially are meant to determine whether a device is compliant or not. That's actually outside of the endpoint security. That's more of a that's essentially evaluation portion of the configuration that results from applying endpoint security policies or baselines. And lastly, you do have actually the ability to deal with aspects such as, for example, attack surface reduction, which we'll talk about in a moment as well. So this slide gives you an indication of what security baselines are about. So these essentially are collections of groups of pre-configured Microsoft recommended security settings, which are applicable to Windows 10 and 11. And the idea is to essentially enhance the existing security on Windows devices. Those actually are fairly extensive. So what you can do, you can actually use those as they are without any additional modifications and simply evaluate what the outcome behavior would be. You also have the option of implementing the device configuration profiles that will be based on those baselines. And you can be selective by choosing the feature that you consider to be relevant, or potentially you might want to tighten those restrictions further. The bottom line is, if you want to use security baselines, you effectively create a profile that will apply to the devices that you apply those that you determine to be in scope, and that simplifies your task by ensuring that your configuration complies with the security best practices provided by Microsoft. And if basically those 4 baselines at this point, so there's security baseline for Windows 10 and 11, and later you have the security baseline for Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, another one for Microsoft Edge, and the last one is for Windows 365 security. Another aspect of the endpoint security that's available within Intune is attack surface reduction. So this also applies to Windows 10 11. These policies are meant to, not surprisingly, reduce your attack surface by effectively minimizing the places where your organization is vulnerable to cyber threats and attacks. And you have basically multiple profiles here, which manage settings specific to a given area on a Windows 10 11 device. And those profiles, as you can see, include the app and browser isolation. This allows you to manage settings for Windows Defender Application Guard, which is part of the Defender for Endpoint. Application Guard is meant to prevent emerging attacks and can isolate enterprise-defined sites as untrusted when defining what sites, cloud resources, and internal networks are considered to be trusted. Next one is web protection, referred to here as the Microsoft Edge Legacy. So these settings can allow you to manage web protection for Defender for Endpoint by setting the machines to secure against web threats. And this actually supports the Edge as well as the third-party browsers, including Chrome and Firefox, allowing you essentially to minimize the threats from internet-based attacks. So this includes protection against phishing sites, malware vectors, exploit sites, untrusted or low reputation sites, as well as sites that you've blocked in your custom indicator list. Next, we have application control. This restricts the applications that user can run and the code that runs in the system core, the kernel code, essentially. So what you can do is you can basically block unsigned scripts. You can block Windows installer packages. You can also ensure that Windows PowerShell will be running in the constrained language mode. Next, we have the attack surface reduction rules. So that's essentially about making sure that the malware and malicious apps will be blocked. And this essentially includes executable files and scripts, obfuscated and suspicious scripts and behaviors that apps usually don't display during normal day-to-day behavior. So essentially, this relies on this anomaly detection in order to determine whether something constitutes a threat or not. Another one is device control. With this setting, you can configure devices for a layered approach to secure removable media. And what's at play here is the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, where this could provide multiple monitoring and control features to help prevent threats from those unauthorized peripherals that potentially might compromise your devices. And lastly, we have exploit protection. So this essentially relies on protection against exploits to infect devices and spread. This actually consists of many mitigations. So there will be another piece that you might want to include in your protection plan. So this concludes our coverage of the configuring endpoint security. Next, let's take a look at the deployment of apps. So effectively, this translates into MAM. And we talk about the fact that you actually can use MAM in two different scenarios. You can combine it with the MDM, or you can run it without device enrollment. That's the MAM WE. And as a result, you have basically two different set of features available to you. The management in MAM comes mainly from the app protection policies. as far as MDM, right, that's about device management. What you can do is, if you want to use MAM by itself, or you want to combine it with the third-party enterprise model management products, or no MDM, that's also an option. But again, keep in mind that has implications regarding the resulting functionality. Just to make sure that this concept is clear, there's a separate slide that talks about app protection policies. We used this term several times before. I want to make sure that the actual idea behind it is clear to everybody. So that's essentially, once again, this constitutes the basis for MAM. And the idea behind it is to essentially make sure that the company data doesn't get intermingled, mixed with the data that belongs to end user. So this essentially creates those containers within the device that protect the company data, make sure that this data doesn't expand beyond the limits of the container itself. And the users, for example, protected or prevented from copying data between the personal store and the store which contains the company data. And this functionality exists for many commercial apps. In particular, there's certainly significant support for Microsoft Office apps and Microsoft apps in general. There's also a way to implement that protection for line of business apps by using the SDKs available from Microsoft. So Microsoft basically provides the SDK, which allows you to build those applications internally within your organization. So in regard to planning Intune MAM, there's a sequence of steps you want to follow, certain considerations you want to take into account in order to implement it. So for one, you would want to start by assessing app requirements. In other words, you want to determine whether it is viable for you to use MAM by itself, whether it's more suitable to use combination of MAM and MDM, whether application requires secure access to on-prem data, which would entail using the VPN gateway or proxy to provide that access. You want to determine whether the application will be available from the store, whether it's going to be available as the in-house written application, line of business, whether application is available as a web-based app. There's additional set of considerations regarding the use of licensed apps. So for those, you want to make sure you incorporate the corresponding licensing requirements. This might entail using Apple Volume Purchasing Program for business, Android work profiles, or Microsoft Store. Another suggestion, which simplifies locating the apps by users, is to create and edit categories for apps. So this way, users will be able to easier find those apps in the company portal. Next consideration would be to evaluate the cloud storage space. Now, this typically is not a problem because those limits are fairly high, but nevertheless, keep in mind they do exist. In particular, there's a limit of 2 gigabytes, I think, for iOS and up to 8 gigabytes for Windows. The bottom line is just keep in mind, if you are planning on using applications which actually do consist of large number of binaries, right, there will be consideration in implementing those by using Intune. And this slide is meant to give you an idea how to go about adding apps to Intune. So in order for you to be able to manage and deploy apps, you first need to add an application into Intune. But by default, there's no apps built into Intune at this point. There used to be. It's no longer the case. So Intune actually supports adding and assigning the following app types, which you see on the current slide. And those include the apps from the store. Those include apps which are written in-house, the line of business ones. Those includes the apps on the web, which essentially are taking the form of the web links. And then you also have the apps for other Microsoft services. In this case, there'll be application-specific or service-specific caveats that need to be taken into account. And as you can see, for each app type, I basically have corresponding installation process. So, for example, when you develop in-house apps, you'd have a corresponding installation files you need to provide to perform the installation, and those are platform-specific. If you want to implement the apps on the web, you'd simply provide a shortcut to WebApp, and correspondingly, you would have a different behavior regarding the updates to the app, depending on the app type as well. Maybe let's expand a little bit on the last type, which is the apps from other Microsoft services. So those can be sourced from either Azure Active Directory or from Office Online. And in case of Azure Active Directory, basically what you do is you register those applications in Azure AD. They essentially become Azure AD register applications. There's also another category called Azure AD Enterprise Applications. And then you can essentially register and assign those via, you actually register and assign those by using Intune Admin Center. So the capability exists within the same interface. They also can be added and registered by using the Azure AD portal within the Azure portal, Azure AD interface with Azure portal. Office Online applications, those are assigned by using licensing controls available in Microsoft 365 Admin Center. And you have the option of basically either hiding or showing those applications to end users within the company portal from within the Intune Admin Center. So in that sense, they're not really much different from what you can do with the other types of apps you can add into Intune. This slide focuses on Windows 10 and 11 app support. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. This just focuses on 2 of the types of apps you can add. So that's about line of business apps and Microsoft Store apps. Notice that the Windows 10 and 11 line of business apps must be signed and uploaded into Intune. And they include basically different types of application packaging formats. So Universal Windows Platform apps, APX apps, and Win32 apps are some of the more commonly used examples. And in this case, since you're responsible for the updates, right, updates would need to be manually uploaded and deployed. Notice that in this case, there's no user intervention or no user interaction involved in their updates. So that essentially becomes your responsibility in terms of their installation, deployment, and maintenance. In terms of the Microsoft Store apps, those are modern apps synchronized to Intune. They can be online or offline licensed, and updates are automatic. They're supported as automatic updates, but you can actually block those as an admin as well. And as a side note, also something to keep in mind, all Windows app types require enrollment. Right? So in this case, you want to be able to deploy apps to target devices. Those devices have to be enrolled. And this brings us to a topic of the app configuration policies for Intune. And the basic idea behind app configuration policies is to help eliminate app setup problems by letting you, as the Intune admin, assign configuration settings to a policy that is assigned to end users before they run the app. And as a result, those settings will be applied then automatically when the app is configured on the end user's device, eliminating the need for the end users to take an action. And those settings are unique per app. So whether you configure it or not really is entirely up to you. It really ties to the app you added to Intune. Those apply, by the way, to iOS, iPadOS, and Android apps. So the resulting configuration settings will essentially be used to customize application configuration and management of those apps. Those can include, for example, a custom port number. They can include language settings, security settings, branding settings to include compatible logo. Just kind of some of the more common examples of those type of settings that you would include in the app configuration. In terms of delivery, this can be actually delivered by using either the MDM or MAM channel. Specifically, the channel itself would determine essentially whether this applies to devices which are enrolled into Intune or not. And there are a few different ways to actually determine whether app configuration has been applied. You can certainly use visual verification on the device itself. You can review diagnostic logs. You also can use the Intune Admin Center. So that would essentially reflect the outcome of the configuration will be indicated within the Admin Center interface. The details would really depend on whether that's device or user install. And as I mentioned, you actually do have the option of using the managed apps which were developed by internally, for example, by your own company. For that, you basically use that. You would use basically that Intune app SDK, or there's also support for Intune wrapping tool. So either one of those would essentially allow you to work with the managed apps using app configuration. Now, details of it are actually, as you can see here, based on the slide I'm presenting right now, are platform specific. So what you can do with regard to app management differs from platform to platform. So this slide actually talks about being able to add and assign apps to device and users. Right? So as you can see, that's supported on all the platforms. I guess Windows Phone release doesn't belong here anymore. Really shouldn't. So disregard the last column, right? That needs to be updated. You'll be able to assign apps to devices not enrolled in Intune, right? That's supported on Android and iOS. And actually, you will see that it's pretty much a trend, right? For the most part, the full support is available on the current modern mobile platforms, with less functionality available on the macOS and Windows 10 and Windows 11. So I guess if you kind of take a look at the slide without paying too much attention to details, right? You just look at the layout of the yeses and nos within a table. You notice the trend where majority functionality is available for Android and iOS, and less so on the macOS and Windows 10 side. So this is the first slide that illustrates those capabilities that include, again, adding assigning apps to devices and users, to devices which are not enrolled in Intune, right? That's really supported only for Android and iOS. Using app configuration policies to control the type of behavior apps. That's, again, the same too. With the next one, which essentially involves using mobile app provisioning process to renew an expired app. That's only iOS. Protecting company data in apps with app protection policies. That's the very essence of the app protection policies, right? In this case, that's applicable only to Android and iOS. So on the Windows side, that used to be handled by using Windows Information Protection policies. These days, the recommendation is actually used for this purpose Purview. So like Purview kind of became the replacement for that functionality on the Windows side. Then we also have the remove only corporate data from an installed app, right? Again, in this case, we also have the we actually do have support in this case for Android, iOS, and Windows. So that's the app selective wipe. And here's another set of capabilities. In this case, actually, you do see more widespread support, typically actually across the all four, with some exceptions on the macOS side. So monitoring app assignments, right? That's available directly from the Intune from the admin center. Next, we have assigning and tracking volume purchased apps from the App Store. That's available in this case on the phone Windows 10. And mandatory installed. Notice in this case, right, we have to have device enrolled. So for this case, for this to work, basically you need to have the enrollment in place. Optional installation, that's available on all the platforms. So you, especially in this case, you simply make it available to users. And in this case, you don't necessarily have to have device enrolled into Intune. Next one is installing shortcuts for web apps. That is also universal supported. In-house, we actually have support for this on all the current platforms. With the store apps, this applies to Android, iOS, and Windows. And lastly, update, that is also supported for those three. So even I think actually it's probably worth noting that in general, that's sort of the level of detail you might want to pay attention to, because ultimately, whether a feature is supported or not would likely be depending, at least to some extent, on the platform. And we will see sort of the trend in other areas as well. This also ties to the topic of the different assignment types. And so those implied, as alluded to by the entries on the in the tables on the previous slide. We essentially have those different options regarding the assignment of applications. As in general, assignment basically means we want to target a group consisting of either users or devices to have the application installed. And this can be, the assignment can apply to a device, it can apply to the user, and then depending on the context, can be, for example, required. So we can make the app available for enrolled device, which basically means that you would assign an app to a group of users who can install the app from the company portal app website. We can make apps available with or without enrollment, which basically means that in this case we do have the option of making those apps available to users who didn't enroll their devices into Intune. But for users to be able to take advantage of it, they do have to have an Intune license. Then we have required apps. Those apps are installed on devices in the selected groups. So in this case, Intune would actually automatically install or reinstall and update the corresponding app within the assignment, within a assignment period, within 24 hours. So this applies essentially to enforced installation of an app which is unattended. Effectively, would have the app available on the device without the users getting involved. And then lastly, uninstall, that essentially allows us to remove the application after it was installed. And then uninstall can be also made available. It can be performed through available for enrolled devices or required assignment. Notice this does not apply to web links. And in terms of time window, right, it's done within 24 hours. Another aspect of assignments is presented on the current slide. So this sort of tells you essentially who you can assign apps to and what actions you can actually perform through assignment, depending on whether the device is enrolled into Intune or not. So not surprisingly, right, you see a trend here. If I want to basically enforce installation, if I want to assign the application to the device, that will imply the need for device being enrolled into Intune. So I think for the most part, that's fairly intuitive. Similar, the same would apply to uninstalling apps, right? In this case, the device would need to be enrolled into Intune. So hopefully this all makes sense, right? Let me know if you have any questions regarding this. Let's next focus on the deployment of apps in specific platforms. So we're going to start with the deployment of apps on Windows 10, Windows 11 devices. And then depending on the app type, you can install the app on Windows 10 device in one of two ways. The first one involves or performs the installation in the user context. The second one performs the installation in the device context. So when the device is deployed in the user context, the managed app is installed only for that user. And that essentially happens when the user, well, once the user signs into the device. Notice that installation actually would not take place until the user signs into the device. So there's dependency between the two. This is available for modern line of business apps and store apps, both online and offline. And you actually do have support for both required and available intent. Same would apply to Win32 apps. Those actually have to be built as user mode or dual mode. As far as device context, in this case, the app is deployed directly into the device by Intune without user involvement. And this applies to line of business apps, modern line of business apps, and Microsoft Store apps, which are offline licensed, that are deployed with the required intent. And this also applies to Win32 apps, which are built either as the machine mode or dual mode with the required intent as well. And not surprisingly, right, they cannot be targeted to a user. The target device must support device context. And assignment cannot be changed from device to user. Now, there might be some conflicts. So you might, for example, be targeting the application in two different contexts, like one user, one device, and there might be a conflict between those settings. If that's the case, the device context policy would have higher precedence, higher priority than the user context policy. And then an install policy has a higher priority than uninstall policy. So these are the rules essentially to drive the resulting behavior. And conflicts are fairly tricky to troubleshoot. So in general, you should avoid them, but obviously that becomes much more challenging in larger environments. So in case this happens, right, this kind of gives you an indication what would be the resulting behavior. When you create app assignments, the way the process is designed, you have the option of using a combination of inclusions and exclusions. In other words, when you basically set an assignment for the policy, then you can choose to either include or exclude specific groups of users and devices to which the policy will apply. And this is actually more of a universal concept. This appears multiple times in the interface. It applies as well to app assignments, but it stresses the point that essentially your deployments will be based on a group membership. You could potentially avoid creating groups by using all users and all devices. You also can combine the two, so you can basically deploy to all users and all devices. But more commonly, you would actually want to target designated groups. Another option, which actually is not really displayed here on the current slide, is to use so-called filters. That those allow you to further refine the scope of the assignment when deploying app configuration policies, for example, for managed iOS and Android devices. Those filters can be defined at the tenant level. And then we'd be able to essentially use those filters in order to specify, to narrow down the scope of the assignment. And now keep in mind that Intune doesn't evaluate. So we talk about the fact that assignments are implemented through groups. So groups will contain their users group or devices. Keep in mind that Intune doesn't evaluate the user to device group relationship. So in general, you might want to avoid mixed groups in terms of assignments. You might want to just target either user devices. The same would apply if you decide to use all users and all devices, right? In this case, you might want to make sure that you don't use a combination of either one with another group that contains either user devices. Okay, let's talk about the next section, which is about implementing device compliance. And the underlying functionality is implemented by using so-called compliance policies. So MDM solutions like Intune help you protect organizational assets by requiring that users and devices meet specific requirements from the security and compliance standpoint. And in Intune, that is accomplished by using compliant policies. What they do is they define rules and settings that users and devices must meet in order to be compliant. Those include actions that will apply to devices that are non-compliant. And those actions would, for one, allow you to alert users to the conditions of non-compliance and effectively prompt users to take actions to address those issues. Another common scenario where you use the compliance policies is combine them with conditional access. So what you can do is you can actually evaluate compliance of a device and make compliance contingent, or make the ability to connect to your organization remotely contingent on full compliance. Or potentially you might want to limit access depending on whether the device is deemed to be compliant or not. There are essentially two parts to compliant policies in Intune. There are compliance policy settings, and those are tenant-wide. Those apply to every single device that is enrolled into Intune. They basically set a baseline of how compliance policy works in the Intune environment. For example, you can specify whether a device that hasn't received any device compliance policies is considered to be compliant or non-compliant. And then the second part is device compliant policy, which performs specific rules, applies specific rules, which are platform specific. And those are settings that you define in order to dictate whether the device is meant to be viewed as compliant or not. So this can be, let's say, the minimum version of the OS. This can be disk encryption being enabled. And once the device satisfies those rules, it is considered to be compliant. So regarding the uses, right, that's sort of what I mentioned earlier on. There's basically those two main cases. The first one with conditional access, the other without conditional access. So you can certainly leverage the compliance in both scenarios, whether you use conditional access or not. Let's talk about requirements and planning for device compliance policies. This seems rather obvious, right? But you do need to have an Intune in place. That's, I guess, not particularly insightful. You also need to have Azure AD, as we talked about. That's a requirement for Intune. And again, you have the dependency on the premium licensing if you decide to use conditional access. In terms of supported devices, this includes Android, iOS, macOS, Ubuntu, and Windows 10, 11. Notice that in this case, we do have a requirement for device enrollment. So device has to be enrolled into Intune in order for us to determine its compliance. Also, device must have one user or be enrolled without a primary user. So there's no support for enrollment to multiple users. Next, let's talk about implementing Intune device compliance policies. So the way you would go about it, you start by creating policy, assigning policy, specifying actions to apply in case the device is non-compliant, and also you would start implementation. Actually, even prior to implementation, you'd want to make sure you define those tenant-wide settings. So let's talk about this a little more. So as far as creation of policy, what you do is you basically define the rules and settings that users and managed devices must meet in order to be compliant. And we talk about some examples already, right? So minimum OS version, not being jailbroken will be another one, not being rooted, another one. Also, we talk about different threat levels earlier on when we discussed planning for into deployment, right? So it'll be another consideration to account for. You might want to basically define different threat levels to determine to what extent devices deemed to be non-compliant. We also talked about the actions that you can invoke if the device is detected as non-compliant. So this includes the ability to send an email to users and groups. You would want to basically inform the user who is the owner of the device that the user's device is not compliant, so the user can actually take an action to address it. A more drastic action would involve remotely locking the device that typically apply to device that has been non-compliant for an extensive amount of time. You also can effectively retire devices, and again, after the device has been non-compliant for an extended period of time, you can actually enforce the retirement of the device. So they'll basically mark the device as ready to be retired. And then you as an admin, you'll be able to review the list and you would take an action to retire it. So this is not really automatic retiring of the device. This is meant to give you an indication which devices are ready to be retired. So there's still an explicit action to be taken on your part. In terms of those tenant-wide settings, right, essentially those determine whether devices that haven't received the compliance policy are meant to be viewed as compliant or non-compliant. Compliant is the default. Another one is another setting, which is tenant-wide, deals with the jailbreak detection. That's actually applicable to iOS. It is by default disabled. And there's a reason for this because that feature actually increases the power usage, the battery usage. So it does involve you actually making conscious decision that you want to actually enable it for the sake of security. And then lastly, we have the compliance status validity period. So that's set by default to 30 days. So that essentially is the maximum of time during which the device must be reporting its state. So once the period expires, actually there should be no minimum but maximum. So once the period expires, right, basically that device that hasn't reported will be considered non-compliant. Another aspect of device configuration is the use of device configuration profiles. Hopefully this is not becoming too confusing, but as I mentioned earlier on, the way this works out is you actually have different ways of controlling the device behavior, so to speak. On one hand, you can actually actively control the configuration of the device. And on the other, you can basically use the evaluation in order to determine whether the device is compliant or not. So the compliance policies give you that compliance piece, compliance information. The configuration profiles are meant essentially to provide the way to configure the device. And what might be potentially confusing is the fact that you actually do have the option of accomplishing common set of goals, overlapping set of goals, by using endpoint protection policies and configuration profiles. For example, you can implement encryption using both. Let's say if you want to use BitLocker, that option exists for both. So the question really becomes, as I mentioned earlier on, right, choosing between the two and choosing those that potentially are more suitable for a specific task. So in general, the recommendation would be to rely on the endpoint protection policies to implement security-related settings, and use the configuration profiles for everything else. That is especially more important because, as I understand, the future direction and basically the development efforts are steered towards building functionality of the endpoint protection, as opposed to using configuration profiles. So you're probably better off to build the functionality around the endpoint as opposed to using configuration profiles for certain things. Again, there's certainly a room for both to play the role in your management strategy, but in general, so that's the overall direction you might want to consider. But in this case, just as is the case with others, right? What you do is you essentially create quote-unquote profiles, which represent collection of configurable settings of device, of a device, and what you do is you apply those settings through group assignments. So let's say I want to apply a specific set of settings to my Windows 10 or 11 devices. I would create a group corresponding to those devices, create a corresponding profile, and then assign that profile to the group. And with that assignment, you can also use kind of a number of different other options that would allow you to narrow down the scope of the assignment if needed. Some examples would include, for example, allowing or preventing access to Bluetooth on the device, creating a Wi-Fi or VPN profile that gives different devices access to your corporate network. Another commonly used set of settings is the management of software updates. Another one would be running an Android device as a dedicated kiosk device. So that the device will be running on a single app. Another one would be running OS iPad and macOS devices, allowing users to, on those devices running, allowing users to use, for example, a printer. And just to give an idea of the range of capabilities that are available to you, here's the listing of Intune device profile categories. So again, given the fact that there's actually this huge collection of different settings you can control, what Intune provides is the categories of profiles, which simplifies the configuration, allows you basically to focus on specific functionality and easily determine which settings would apply where. And that also might be the strategy you want to follow, right? So basically what you would do is you want to make sure you actually create those specialized categories of all the specialized categories in order to make the management a bit more organized, easier to handle in the long run, and especially in larger environments. So I won't necessarily be going through each one of those, right? I just this is meant to indicate to you, give an idea how much flexibility you have available to you when using device profiles. And those would keep in mind also that those would be, some of these, right, are specific to platforms. So for example, group policy analytics, as you would expect, is specific to, or group policy in general is specific to Windows 10 and Windows 11. Certificates will actually apply to all of the platforms, right? So depending on which category you pick, you might actually see different support across different platforms. So this is the this slide provides clarification regarding implementing Microsoft Intune device profiles. So really follows the information presented on the previous slide. So as you can see, this applies to a number of different platforms. So depending on the what you do is essentially when you create a profile, you can select the options available, which are listed on the current slide. You can basically use administrative templates. You can use baselines. You can use setting catalog. You can also use templates. And the one which provides most flexibility is the settings catalog, because in this case, you're basically just given full access to the catalog of settings which are available to you, and you can pick those selectively in any combination you want. But that becomes a bit overwhelming. So you might actually want to steer towards using the use of templates, because templates essentially allow you to sort of decide which settings are more applicable in a given scenario. And when you assign the profile, you do it again through group membership. So you assign to groups. You have the option of using inclusion exclusions. You can specify all users, all devices, and combination of both. Another filtering option that you have available to you is referred to as the so-called applicability rule. And the idea is basically to provide you with the ability to target specific sets of Windows 10, Windows 11 devices. And so, for example, you can specify the criteria that involve the use of Windows 10 Enterprise. So you can basically filter it based on the edition of Windows. You also can specify a filter which is based on, let's say, OS edition, OS version. So there's essentially some additional flexibility built into the product, which helps you narrow down the scope of the assignment. Additional piece that we talk about, that's something that's called a scope tag. Scope tag is more about the role-based access control, so you can actually section your environment into different areas and grant permissions to manage a specific set of devices or users to your admin staff, for example, depending on location, depending on department. That really goes kind of beyond the scope of this level 100 webinar, the presentation. So let me just quickly review the different. I'm going to go back to the initial bullet point that talks about profiles and settings. So administrative templates, essentially, those templates are matching the template settings that you might know from the group policy technology. So if you're familiar with ADMX templates and GPLs, that should ring a bell. Baselines, those are again the pre-configured security settings that we talked about earlier on. Settings catalog, as I mentioned, this essentially is that collection of all the possible configuration options available to you. And there's also templates available for Android, iOS, iPadOS, and macOS, and Windows devices that you can use as well. So those really are not related in any way to admin templates. Right? There's essentially groupings of settings which are related to each other. So those would help you basically narrow down the scope of the specific profile to the area that you want to control. And one more thing to keep in mind, so those are applied essentially based on an interval. So there's communication between the Intune service and managed devices. Devices basically periodically will check for updates. By default, that happens every 8 hours. Now, there's a bit of a caveat there. It's just a bit more nuanced, but in general, basically every 8 hours, you would expect the device to check for updates. Intune service actually would notify the device if there is a change to a profile, or the profile is being updated, or the profile is being assigned to a device. So there's also this trigger that comes from Intune going to the service. So if the device is available, we'll actually apply that new or updated profile sooner than every 8 hours. beyond the profiles, beyond the settings which are defined for you, so beyond those settings which are part of the service setting catalog, you also have the option of implementing custom settings. And that's defined by using the process that's described on the current slide. So even though you have the lots of built-in settings to control different features on device, you also have the option of creating basically custom profiles, which are essentially collections of settings that you control by using the OMA URI standards on Android and Windows, or Apple Configurator on iOS and macOS. And to implement those, basically, you start by selecting the device platform and then adding custom settings depending on the choice of your platform. So, for example, when you use the OMA URI settings, you specify name, description, OMA URI, data type, and a value. So this essentially goes beyond this, brings you the functionality which doesn't exist, which is not built into the product. You can essentially use it in order to kind of go beyond the settings which are predefined for you, if it comes to that, right? If you basically want to control the target devices at a more granular level, that's also available to you. Okay, let's go through enrolling devices. So let's talk about device enrollment. We talked about this earlier on, as you might recall. So there's going to be a bit of a more detailed coverage of the enrollment process in Intune. You have the number of supported platforms that you need to consider when you want to enroll devices into Intune. That's supported for both personal and corporate-owned devices. And you have a number of different enrollment scenarios. Those include bring your own device. Those include the use of so-called device enrollment manager. That term came up before. Basically, what this is a IT user typically. Doesn't have to be, but it basically is a user who you allow to enroll devices on behalf of actual device owners, or users who will be using the devices. And the limit on the number of devices you can enroll in Intune as a user is 15. With the device enrollment manager, you actually can raise that limit to 1,000. So basically, you can enroll up to 1,000 devices by using a single enrollment manager. Another option for enrollment is through MDM or group policy. That happens for AD joint devices. There is also support to autopilot. We talked about Windows Autopilot earlier on. This might be called basically that essentially involves using designated packages that you create in order to perform specific tasks in an automated, unattended manner. Another one would be bulk enrollment. That's for Windows 10 and 11. And lastly, another enrollment scenario would be to be used in the combination with configuration managers, so co-management scenarios. And now, here's another set of slides that allow you to distinguish between those scenarios. So depending on your environment, you might or might not be able to implement specific enrollment methodology. So if you look at the first header row in the table, you'll basically see the listing of those different enrollment methods. And then on the left-hand side, you'll look at best practices, right? This describes the scenario that a given enrollment method would apply to or not. So the bottom line is, right, the typical methodologies that you would use in cloud-based scenarios, they involve the Azure AD joint with autopilot, or Azure AD joint with autopilot in a self-deploying mode. Either user-driven mode or self-deploying mode. And I guess I don't believe we have a lot of time left to really focus on details here. Just to kind of give you a quick indication of what essentially is available to you. Let me just step through those next few slides so you can actually glance through the content. The questions regarding this, please post them in a chat. But it's just going to give you an idea of what those different capabilities are. Okay, so hopefully this provides some insight to you regarding the enrollment capabilities. And now let's talk about the way to control Intune device enrollment. So the first feature that you can actually implement in order to provide some level of control is to use terms and conditions. We talked briefly about it. So as you recall, terms and conditions essentially are about requiring user access to accept the organization's terms and conditions. You can, through enrollment restrictions on the tenant level, restrict specific features in order to allow or disallow a specific set of devices. So it was also mentioned briefly earlier on, as you might recall, this essentially allows you to specify a particular OS version. This applies to min and minimum and maximum version of the OS. You can restrict the number of devices a user can enroll. By default, again, this is 15. By default, it's set to 5. You can also block enrollment of personal-owned devices. That's not available notice on Windows. So there's only iOS, Android, and macOS. Another one is the allowing Apple device enrollment. This actually requires you to provide the APN certificate to MDM. So that's essentially sort of by default it's not available unless you provide it. You won't be able to enroll Apple devices. Next one, which ties to device enrollment, is using so-called corporate identifiers. So this allows you basically to specify which devices, once enrolled, would be considered to be corporate-owned, organization-owned. Another restriction you can put in place to control the enrollment is using MFA. And another one was mentioned earlier on, right, to actually do it through device enrollment manager. So in this case, you would be able to control enrollment simply by handing over to a designated person. Next topic is about enrolling Windows devices into Intune. So there are basically two main methods, right? So again, it's basically the self-enrollment. You allow users to perform enrollment. And the other one is the admin-driven enrollment. As far as self-enrollment, this can be performed using the BYOD approach, as can be done in combination with the Azure AD join. It also can be done by using Windows Autopilot. So you can basically provide the Windows Autopilot configuration to users, and they'll be able to leverage it in order to enroll devices to both Azure AD and Intune. Next set, the second set, is about using policies to force automatic enrollment without any user interaction. And this involves the use of a hybrid Azure AD join. So again, if you have hybrid environment, your devices are AD joined, you can automatically enroll them by relying on Azure AD join. Another one is configuration manager co-management. Another was device enrollment manager. Another one bulk enrollment. And lastly, we have the Windows IT Core device enrollment. This talks about the process of self-enrolling of Windows devices. The simplest way to do it is basically go to the Settings app on a Windows device. You could use that interface to both register the device with Azure AD, as well as enroll the device as the personally owned device. And then depending on the configuration itself, the user will enter their credentials once, or they will need to re-enter their credentials once they enroll into MDM once the device is Azure AD joined or registered. So there's basically a couple ways to do it. The first approach relies on you having Azure AD premium licensing. That obviously simplifies deployment, but you also can do it using the second approach where users prompted twice to authenticate. Another one is to use the Azure AD join during UBI or from the Settings app. And that essentially would entail or would imply that auto-enrollment is enabled on the Azure AD tenant side. So again, this requires Azure AD premium licensing. The device is automatically enrolled in Intune. Otherwise, the users would have to enroll the device separately. And then this allows users to sign into Windows with their Azure AD credentials, and device is marked as a corporate owned in Intune. So that actually ties to the topic of the devices being marked as either corporate owned or personal in Intune. There are certain settings you can configure in order to force the device to be recognized as corporate owned. You can always change it afterwards. So even if the device is registered as personal in Intune, that can be modified afterwards. And then autopilot would be another option, right? So in this case, we rely basically on the autopilot functionality in order to implement automatic enrollment into Intune. And again, if you want to do it while you join Azure AD, you need to make sure that the Azure AD premium licensing is in place, and you configure the enrollment settings on the Azure AD side as well. Here's the listing, more details regarding the administrator-based enrollment method. So in this case, we can implement through group policy for hybrid. We can also use the configuration manager in a co-management scenarios. We talked about device enrollment manager. And notice this actually precludes the use of conditional access because you essentially do it on behalf of users. So in this case, conditional access doesn't really apply. Next one is you want to enroll through bulk enrollment. So you basically use provisioning packages to do so. Again, this also, given the fact is done on behalf of users, right? It doesn't involve the use of conditional access. And lastly, with the IoT core devices, so in this case, you would use the IoT core specific process to implement it. Let's take a look at some of the mechanisms that can be used to simplify enrollment for Windows devices. So in this case, we can use the automatic enrollment on Azure AD side. That was mentioned a couple times before. Another one is CNAME registration. So we can actually modify DNS configuration for our DNS name in our DNS registrar in order to simplify the process of enrolling devices by allowing something that's called auto discovery. And lastly, the bulk enrollment that essentially relies on creating the packages through Windows Configuration Designer. And that involves the use of Azure AD Join to trigger the enrollment into Intune. So here's how you would configure the Azure Active Directory to facilitate automatic MDM enrollment during Azure AD Join. And this can be done from the Azure portal. This can be done from the Intune admin center. In either case, you actually work with the same exact interface. You basically, what you do is you configure the MDM and MAM scope. And for each one of them, basically, you specify values which are meant to reflect the Intune-based deployment enrollment. And for each one of them, you specify essentially who that setting should apply to. And there are three options. There is none, some, and all. So none would basically mean that you effectively disable automatic enrollment. Some would allow you to specify groups that you want to target by using the enrollment, by using this automatic enrollment. And all would basically mean that this applies automatically to all the users who join their devices, Windows 10 and Windows 11 devices, to Azure Active Directory. And in case of conflicts, there's also a specific set of behaviors that would follow. So for personal devices, the MAM scope would take precedence. And for corporate devices, the MDM scope would take precedence if both scopes are enabled, right? If there's one MDM scope enabled, then clearly MAM would not apply. But if you enable both scopes and the user happens to be in groups that are designated by both MDM user scope and MAM user scope, in that case, the device would become MDM enabled. And this is the information regarding the configuration of the auto discovery on the DNS side, right? So again, what I can do is I can either let the users type in the full name when they need to enroll the device. So basically, need to provide the Intune service name, which is enrollment.managed.next.com, or I can potentially eliminate this altogether by creating a CNAME record in my DNS registrar. And the DNS which is basically DNS servers which are responsible, authoritative for my domain. Effectively, they will eliminate that prompt and potentially eliminate some of the issues users might be running into when they type the Intune service name. Okay, we're actually a couple minutes away from top of the hour. So apologies. I want to make sure we follow the schedule. We are running out of time. I want to make sure that we actually address any questions you might have. So let me just take a quick look at those questions and see if I can actually provide some insights on any of the questions you brought up. So I'm looking, Mark. I'm looking at your comment. Can you restate the comment about the change in using device configuration profiles? Could you clarify which comment you're referring to? And feel free to come just state it through audio or put it in the chat. Either way. Sure. Yeah. No problem. Okay, so actually, I do see a number of questions that I'm quite certain we're going to address in the 200th session. So I certainly welcome you to join us for 200. I will make sure that whatever you placed as questions in a chat will be included in the session. And actually, probably some of these are more suitable for 200 level anyway. We're actually out of time at this point. Mark, if you have a chance to post that question, it'll be fantastic. If not, we can just make sure that your question is included in the 200 session. So I guess I'll leave it to Brian to provide the date for the. Okay, so you actually, Mark, you will have access to the slides once you, I guess, if you don't mind, if you can post your question, I guess, in a more direct manner in the chat, right? We will record it. We make sure that this gets included in the 200 level session. Okay, good deal. So thank you very much. We appreciated your presence, your attendance. I'm hoping that you actually found this valuable. And I'm looking forward if you decide to join the 200 level session to talk to you again. Thanks, everybody.